People around the world have become much more aware of how much the changes in the climate are affecting their lives and their prospects.
The program will be starting shortly. Please take your seats and direct your attention to the stage. Thank you. The program will be starting shortly. Please take your seats and direct your attention to the stage. Thank you.
People around the world have become much more aware of how much the changes in the climate are affecting their lives and their prospects.
Climate change is the greatest risk to human well-being over the next century. It is not a problem in isolation. We named the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth, because what societies around the world must do is find a way to balance climate change and the need for growth and improvements in human well-being.
When it comes to the research, the university brings certain areas of extraordinary strength. For example, our long-standing excellence in the areas of economics and policy.
Ultimately, the world is going to need new technologies, but if we don't set up markets with the correct incentives, we'll never get the technologies we need.
At the same time, our deep fostering of Argonne National Lab has enabled us over decades to be a place that has played an extraordinary role in the development of many energy technologies, such as energy storage and batteries.
We are trying to build an ecosystem. First, we invent the next best materials for energy storage, for batteries. We hope to plant the seeds for the innovations, for the startups that are upcoming, to bring some of those new discoveries to the impact to the society.
The third area relates to the study of what we've called climate systems engineering.
The University of Chicago has committed to build climate systems engineering as a field, building an integrated program, and that's something no other university is doing, and it's desperately needed to bring some structure to this complicated topic. Climate systems engineering can manage the risks of emissions that have happened in the past. The goal of research on climate systems engineering is to learn more, to understand better which of these techniques might work, what their risks are, how we could reduce those risks, how we can inform sensible public policy decisions about these complicated technologies.
If there's one thing that we need in this world right now, it's people who can really understand the problems of climate and energy from different perspectives. One of the things that this university is renowned for is the core curriculum. Our education curriculum in the climate and energy space will involve economics and policy. It will involve geophysics and the elementary aspects of climate systems engineering, and it will involve physical and biological sciences that underlie the energy technologies of the future. So our students will ultimately be educated in how to see these problems from many different angles.
The Chicago curriculum on climate and sustainable growth is going to be forged here, and ultimately we expect that this curriculum will be adopted in many places around the world. A hallmark of the Institute's efforts will be its international focus. This is because climate change is, after all, a global problem.
As a student, there is only a limited understanding that you can get sitting here in Hyde Park on our campus. But should you go abroad, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, those academic settings almost act as a mirror in which you begin to recognize yourself, your limitations of your point of view, and how other people think.
A challenge that we've set for ourselves at the Institute is that it's not simply enough to produce new ideas and keep them inside the bubble of academia. What's critical is to develop those new ideas and then go test them in the real world, and ultimately ensuring that those ideas deliver improvements in human well-being.
Right now, the world is looking for places where they can have trust in what's being said. A place where everything can be on the table and debated. A place where the research is done with a great deal of rigor. So it's a kind of calling for a university like ours to contribute in the best ways that it can.
Welcome. welcome everyone to a really exciting afternoon celebrating the launch of this institute. I'm Kate Baker, I'm Provost of the university, and I have the wonderful job today of just being the MC. So I get to introduce a star-studded panel and then sit back and learn from them with all of you. So I am really looking forward to this afternoon because I have no responsibilities except to learn and appreciate. All of the work that you're going to see today is the culmination of efforts of years of work by so many faculty, partners, government leaders, industry affiliates to be able to bring together the array of programming that you heard hinted at in this video and that you're going to learn much more about today. This couldn't be a more important moment to do this. Tragically, every day we hear about extreme climate events and the toll that they're taking on people around the planet. And the approach required to deal with that is something that we can contribute to at the University of Chicago in a way that few other institutions can. So I'm thrilled to be able to introduce today's speakers, but also so excited to see all of you in the audience and all of you online who are joining us in this endeavor. First, I'd like to welcome to the stage President Paul Alivisatos, without whom we wouldn't be here. He came to us from the University of Chicago, from the University of California, Freudian slip, but coming back to the University of Chicago, where he did his undergraduate studies. His wealth of experience is really responsible for being able to launch this initiative, but also bring together partners across campus with appointments in the Department of Chemistry, Pritzker Molecular Engineering, and the college, and with his leadership of Argonne and Fermi, our national lab affiliates. This is really going to be a signature endeavor of the whole university, and we couldn't have a better leader to do it. So please join me in welcoming President Alivisatos to the stage.
Well, good afternoon. It's such a joy. This day is really such a joy for us. I don't know if you had a chance to be downstairs on the second floor a little while ago and just feel the energy from the students who were down there. It was incredible. And as Kate said, when I became president 3 years ago, I was immediately approached, I would say almost approaching inundated, by students, faculty, and alumni who called on me to foster our university's work in the area of climate and energy. They aspired for UChicago as a leading academic institution to do more to address the climate crisis. It was a very direct call for an engaged University of Chicago to step up. Today, we mark an important milestone in answering that call. Following on the collective work of many people in this room and faculty from across the university, we are proud to introduce the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. The Institute represents a pioneering effort. It will be the University of Chicago's central hub for the whole of the university to bring our best ideas and our best work to a type of challenge that humanity has not faced before. We set out to create this institute, and as we did so, we asked, what strengths does the University of Chicago bring to bear on this challenge? The institute we share today reflects those strengths to maximize our contribution to society in the ways that the University of Chicago is specially called to do. It is rooted in the university's deep culture of asking the hardest questions with candor and a commitment to rigor, to go where facts lead and be unafraid to create entirely new ways of thinking. Our academic culture, everybody kind of knows it, it's grounded in a desire to obtain knowledge for its own sake, to understand patterns and concepts at the deepest level. That academic curiosity and integrity are always our guiding lights, as in this case, we will try to bring those to advancing human health, prosperity, and growth, even as we seek to provide effective frameworks for addressing the climate challenge. This problem is so large, many institutions have established excellent initiatives and institutes. Even as we invite entire schools as well, I should include that, even as we invite the whole of the university to engage in the work of this institute, we have been mindful of focusing on areas where we can contribute distinctively. The Institute builds on the University of Chicago's renowned history for applying economic and policy-based thinking to tackle major societal challenges. The climate crisis is no exception. Harnessing our unmatched strength across the social sciences writ large gives us a tremendous base to work from. Between the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering and our deep partnerships with Argonne National Laboratory, we are home to one of the nation's largest concentrations of energy innovators. Our strength in this area was recognized yet again last month when Professor Meng, right over there, led a big coalition and became home to one of just 2 Department of Energy battery hubs. I mentioned before that we will lean into following facts and ideas where they must go. Early on, our faculty recognized that there is a need to create a new field of climate systems engineering, a field that requires critical testing, a lot of questioning, and deeper understanding, ultimately as a hedge against the unwelcome possibility that large-scale interventions may be needed, even if perhaps only in the short term. We have a vital contribution to make in education as well. The world needs a generation of thinkers and special people who can set the pace, who can see the climate challenge from its many angles, appreciate the societal and economic complexities, understand what is required technically and even politically to confront these problems. At the University of Chicago, we transformed undergraduate education by our curation over many decades of a core curriculum that is globally admired and serves as a model for liberal arts education everywhere. It is in that same spirit that we seek to transform climate education for undergraduates and a suite of new master's degrees, not just for our students here at the University of Chicago, but for students around the world. Leading the faculty through the work of this institute, as you saw, is Michael Greenstone. When we set out with the intention of establishing a new climate institute, I was so grateful that Michael was willing to be at the helm. As the director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, EPIC, he has already carried out field-defining research and scaled policy-changing solutions. He is joined by other renowned leaders in their disciplines, you'll be hearing from them soon, David Keith, to foster the building of climate systems engineering as a field of study, Shirley Meng, to bring us together on groundbreaking energy technologies, as well as David Weisbach from the law school, who will support the crafting of a transformational core curriculum. Their oomph and their leadership makes me so hopeful about our future here. I'm excited today as we begin this journey alongside all of our deeply passionate students and faculty. It's going to be an incredible period where we will bring great benefits to society through their work. I'm very pleased today to see all of this work coming together to bringing us to this moment, and I just want to thank you for being here and for your support of this endeavor. Thank you.
So thank you for kicking this off, President Alivisatos. And as the president said, there is really no one better to lead this institute than Michael Greenstone. He has pioneered research that's influential around the globe, but has also worked in a dedicated way to translate that to real-world impact. And I think it exemplifies all that we're trying to do here. He served as chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors for President Barack Obama, and he created the first government-wide metric for the cost of climate change to society. After coming back to academia, he too came home to the University of Chicago, as all wise people do, and while leading EPIC, has pioneered research in thinking about how climate change is impacting how much we work, where we grow food, what the cost is across nations and within nations to things like air pollution and water pollution. His research helped launch the war on pollution in China and has shown us the cost of air pollution in India on life expectancy. He set up the world's first pollution markets and uncovered key challenges to access and energy around the developing world. So that pioneering research has led academia and has also led to life improvements across the globe, but there's so much more work to do. So you can see why he is really the ideal person to lead this institute. And please join me in welcoming Michael to the podium.
Thank you for that warm invitation. I think that's, so I wanted to just start by saying what an honor it is to be able to do this and to be part of this institution. My history in this institution goes back quite long. My grandmother was on the faculty here. My mom was graduated from the college. My dad taught here, and then of course they had to hire me here. So in the great Chicago tradition, that's how I got this job. So what we're gonna try and do with the Institute is recognize that there are two problems. The first problem is the climate problem, which people are very familiar with. Climate change is having a moment. 2023 was the hottest year. This is probably going to break that record. If you're outside, it's the end of October. It's a little bit hard to believe what the weather is. But of course, that takes other forms too. It's not just a more pleasant fall in Chicago. This is a picture from India where we have there are extraordinary days that are over 40 degrees C and 45 degrees C in the summer. And that impairs people's lives in very consequential ways. It causes premature death. It causes crops to fail. It makes it difficult for people to live. Difficult for people to go to work. And that is one manifestation. Another manifestation of these higher temperatures is here we have poor Asheville, North Carolina, where there's not supposed to be hurricanes. And it's not that, oh, there was a hurricane. There was Hurricane Elaine. And you can see the damage from that here as well. It's also unleashed wildfires in a way and in places that we had not previously thought possible. So if you needed summary measures, I love numbers. One summary measure is CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere before the Industrial Revolution were 280 parts per million. They're now 419. They're going up by 2 to 3 per year every year now. What is that producing? It's produced more than a 1.3 degrees C increase in temperature. When I began working on climate change, I'm a graduate of the Chicago Public Schools. I had a super hard time with Fahrenheit to Celsius, but I have now mastered that. Okay, the second goal, which is interrelated and interconnected to the first goal, and that shouldn't be missed, is the world's need for growth. And there's a lot of ways to try and articulate that. I find pictures are often more powerful than words. And here you have, this is a setting in India, this young schoolgirl trying to study at night and her brother in the background. But low incomes are causing this. They're causing people to lead shorter and sicker lives, just like climate change is. They're causing people to have extraordinarily unpleasant jobs. The things that machines should do, they're doing with their bodies. And so the need for growth around the world almost goes without saying. And of course, it's most evocative when you have these kinds of images. And in fact, many parts of the world have started to grow, and we'll see that in some data as we go along here in a minute. And that growth has been unlocked by access to energy. And the world does not have an example of a society becoming wealthy and all the comforts that come along with that without consuming lots and lots of energy. And of course, that's even true in Chicago. There's families that aspire to better lifestyles for themselves and their children, and that runs through increased energy consumption. So that's not bad per se. The challenging part is that historically, fossil fuels have been the cheapest option for finding energy in many settings around the world. This is just one chart. Our team, I had planned to have 37 charts. Our team has bargained me down to a couple. So you should be grateful to them. So this is just annual CO2 equivalent emissions in billions of tons, and it's just from 1990. And you can see the upward march. Now, the world has agreed to try to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. What would have to happen to attain that? That's what this line shows you here. And you can see it would be an incredibly dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions. And there's been a lot of progress in reducing the rate of increase. And in fact, what we're on is a trajectory that looks a little bit more like that. And the reason is, and the reason that it can appear that there's a tension between these goals of climate and growth is that fossil fuels are projected to remain the cheapest in many settings around the world. So it's these two ideas, climate and growth, and kind of the question, must they really be in conflict with each other, that animate all that we're trying to do with the Institute. And I will claim no credit, but you guys, there should be lots of oohs and ahs for what's coming here. Whoa, look at that. And there is what we are trying to do with the Institute is to find a balance between those two goals, and that animates everything that we do. And let me just give you a flavor of that. Of course, announcing and launching the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. So what are we going to actually try to do? There's been some foreshadowing from our president. So the first thing, if you're in a university, is research is the thing. You wake up in the morning, I'm going to write a better paper than I did yesterday. And so education, depends where the undergraduates, education is first, research is second. And then we're going to have a great focus on, and I'm going to come back to this, global reach and the importance of engaging with the whole world. Okay, so let's just talk about research. So we're at the University of Chicago. I engage pleasantly in many faculty meetings in my department. And in my department, every problem is an economics problem. And if only the world would listen to the economists, we would have such a better world. And so we're going to bring some of that, not too much of that, but we're going to bring some of that to what we try to do and really have at the core that the balance between climate and growth in many ways reflects the kinds of markets that we're willing to set up and the structure of those markets that will allow us to achieve better versions of that. And at the center of that will be the Energy Policy Institute, which I've been leading for the last decade. We have a 12 to 15 highly devoted faculty, all with tattoos on their arm, who have now a track record of producing high impact research, both inside academic journals, but great emphasis has been put on trying to make sure that those ideas get into the wild and affect the world around us. And so some examples of that are a group of researchers involved, myself included, with EPIC, had this idea, hey, cap and trade markets or pollution markets have been so successful in rich countries around the world, yet they're not used very frequently in poor countries, or they're not used at all in poor countries, and maybe that would better help balance the need for growth and pollution and climate. And so we ran an experiment, a real life experiment, and the results were pretty amazing. Pollution went down, industry's compliance went down. You had, in the wonky terms of experiments, you have the treatment group and the control group. By the end, the control group was lobbying the government to be put into the market because they preferred that relative to the existing form of regulation. And the result was the government was like, oh, we know what to do with this. We're going to scale this up. And so now there's multiple pollution markets in India, and we're trying to take this idea more broadly. A second area, this is to illustrate the kinds of work that we aim to do. is, as the Provost mentioned, I was involved in some others and some research demonstrating that the costs of air pollution were greater than people had realized. And not just that academics were unaware of them, but real human beings were unaware of them. And so we took that idea and have developed something called the Air Quality Life Index, which is a tool that provides people a way at 25,000 locations around the world what is the air pollution they're breathing and what is the consequences on their life expectancy. And that's proved very useful. People have been able to make better choices about how they lead their lives and even apply pressure to governments to reduce air pollution. And then another area that is an example is the work on trying to project what the estimates of climate change will be. And this is truly, every president and provost instructs their faculty to do interdisciplinary work, and then you spend a few minutes talking to someone from some other discipline, and they speak a different language, and then you quit. But here we actually persevered, and we've got climate scientists, computational experts, even some economists, trying to project what the damages from climate change will be for the world, and then also at the level of about 12,000 regions around the world. Think of them as like a U.S. county. That work has helped inform the U.S. government's official estimate of what the damages from climate change will be, and we're launching a new project to help localities figure out how to adapt to the damages that they're going to face. You know, if you're in Miami, it's not really helpful to know what's going to happen in Bangladesh. Okay, the second research pillar, and I'm poorly equipped to do this in the presence, and humiliating to do this in the presence of Shirley Mung, who's going to lead these efforts, is the Energy Technologies Initiative. And you know, I'll give my kind of very rough version of it, and hopefully without too much scorn from Shirley, which is every plan that for reducing carbon emissions you should point to Shirley. It depends on Shirley. It all runs through figuring out better storage. We're not going to be able to green the grid unless the batteries get better and less expensive. People are not going to buy EVs at mass scale unless the batteries get less expensive. And so we have a lot riding on Shirley. And at the center of this Energy Technologies Initiative is the need to drive down the cost and the performance of improve the performance of batteries. Shirley's directing it. As the president mentioned a moment ago, Shirley is leading a DOE hub on energy storage that was recently awarded. It was a great honor for the university in recognition of Shirley and her colleagues' work. And is already achieving breakthroughs in trying to help the world move beyond lithium-ion batteries. Another thing I just want to emphasize in our effort to engage with the real world is, of course, the greatest scale-up organization in the world is the private sector. And this is a setting where there are opportunities. Shirley's inventions and her colleagues' inventions can go into the batteries and the phones and the grids that we use. And so she's put together a really impressive energy transition network of companies who want to learn and stay on the frontier of what understanding is so that they can see how to improve the products they produce. Okay, and then the third research pillar is we somewhat audaciously decided that there should be a new field called climate systems engineering. It covers a lot of intellectual space. I like to think of it, and again, this is embarrassing to do in front of my colleague David Keith, who I'm sure will have notes for me on how I'm describing it incorrectly, ranges from pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere to finding ways to cool the planet in the face of the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. And when the original faculty committee that wrote a plan for the university got together, it was very clear this would work if we were able to hire David Keith away from Harvard, and it would fail if we didn't. And thankfully, David Keith is here, and he's leading this effort. It's an incredibly important effort. They'll be turning over and upside down and sideways these technologies to understand their technical strengths, their technical weaknesses, as well as their social strengths and governance weaknesses. And it's an incredibly important effort. Okay, so the second thing that universities do, and again for the undergraduates, I don't know who screwed up my slides, education should have come first. Let me tell you what our plan was. And I see my son here, so I will pick on him a little bit. And I feel sometimes at dinner with my son and his two siblings, there's a little re-education that has to go on, where they have a very one-sided view of the climate, what I like to think of the climate and growth problem. And in truth, they haven't lived, they visit it, but they haven't lived in a place where incomes are very low or energy consumption is very low. And so kind of with them in mind, but obviously much more broadly than that, we developed, and David Weisbeck, who's here, has been leading this effort, what we're calling the Chicago Curriculum on Climate and Sustainable Growth. And the idea is a new way of understanding this balancing act that society faces. And it will require all students to see the problem from a real 360-degree perspective, not just from a particular angle. And the way it's going to accomplish that is it has a series of core courses that everyone will have to take. This is going to manifest in ideally an undergraduate program and a series of master's programs in climate science, in climate and energy economics, politics and the law of energy and climate, energy technology and energy systems. We're even going to have a humanistic or humanities course on the relationship between humans and the planet over very long time scales and how to think about that. Climate impact, course on climate impacts and adaptation, and incorporating international perspectives on energy and climate. And then again, someone has snuck into this. This is the course I'm going to teach. Evidently, it's the last one in the core, but we'll discuss that later. Having completed that core, what students will then do is find some area that speaks to them that they can specialize in. That might be climate science, that might be climate politics, economics, and society. These are the ones that signed up already. Climate finance, energy and climate technology, and then we look to grow these areas of specialization even more. In talking about the educational program, it would be amiss, I think, not to talk about one course that we think is especially unique. And that is there's going to be a capstone experiential learning course. So it's one thing to sit here and learn about all these things in the classroom in some, obviously it was very compelling faculty, but in some kind of abstract way. And so we've devised an experiential course where the students now having got this 360-degree perspective will go to rural India. And they'll see what it's like to live with a couple hundred kilowatt hours of electricity. They'll then go to West Texas and see what like a booming fracking town looks like and why energy production is so important to so many people. They'll then have to go to Wall Street and meet ruthless capital allocators who only care about return on investment. And then they'll go to Washington and get to meet with policymakers. And out of those divergent viewpoints, they will have to, ideally, they'll have the tools to hold these multiple competing thoughts in their head and ideally produce better leaders and better citizens. And so that's what our aim is. The last thing I want to mention is our intended global reach. So there's a lot of ways, as I said, so we'll go back one slide. This is a picture of Bangkok, but as I said, I find numbers comforting in their own way, or clarifying is maybe the right way to say it. And so this is, here I've put electricity consumption. Probably many of you have not heard of the state of Bihar, India. It's got 130 million people in it. That's more than a third of the United States. There, the average person is consuming 200 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. So what is a kilowatt hour? Well, if you want a context, in the United States, it's 13,000. So those guys are off by not like a factor of 5 or a factor of 10. They're off by a factor of 65. And they're going to be incredibly devoted to increasing that. And then it kind of almost follows that 80% of projected greenhouse gas emissions in the remainder of the century are actually going to come from places, there's lots of Bihars, are going to come from places like Bihar or from the non-OECD countries. And that recognition, which is I would not call deep math, is one that is going to animate all that we do through research and education. And very fortunately, the university has centers in Beijing that we're going to leverage, and have been leveraging, both for research and education. There's a center in Delhi that a lot of my research has flowed through there. There's the terrific center in Hong Kong, and there's the new John Boyer Center in Paris. And so those are all be kind of making sure that we're staying honest and true to the problem that the world is confronting. And so the last thing I'll talk about briefly is when we started this, we did a listening tour, and it sounds like the president had his own listening tour when he started. And what was really surprising was, it was not very surprised about the students, but what was surprising was the depth and breadth of interest from the faculty. And we realized like we're sitting on this monster that needs to be unlocked. And so another aim of the Institute is to catalyze in all of UChicago approach. And so that's going to be on the research side, seeding new research ideas. The Institute's going to act as a hub for climate research and ideas. There's this 150 faculty who have raised their hand that they're interested. We're going to provide research resources for funding for projects, and that has already launched. We're going to have conferences and workshops where people can sharpen their ideas, visitor programs, and more and more. And in fact, you know, if you have an idea, please let us know. And then on the student side, the aim is all this amazing energy can be channeled to something really productive. And so we have these career tracks where people are going to learn about jobs in energy or in climate. There's a career fair downstairs. Obviously, you shouldn't leave while any of us are talking, but it's amazing. There's 50 companies down there. There's undergraduates passing out their resumes left and right. That we want to expose them to what the world is like outside of Chicago. And there'll be plenty of opportunities for funded research assistantships and internships. Okay, so let me try and close with, you know, the mission that I'm going to hold myself to and that we're going to hold ourselves to really comes from the report that we wrote for the president originally. The Institute's mission must be to fundamentally alter climate research and education on a global scale. And I think what we missed is, and make sure that it interacts with the outside world. And so that's what we'll be doing every day. Thank you.
So thank you, Michael, for laying out that 360-degree vision of all that the Climate Institute can do. And I know I'm really excited to see the panelists and what it will bring forward. But of course, that 360-degree approach is not just about what we do in academia. As per your ending note, it's about translating that to real-world impact and engaging with the rest of the world. And that requires partners from business, from civil society, from government. And we are very lucky to be located in Illinois and to have Governor J.B. Pritzker as a critical ally in this mission. He's an advocate for climate action, education, economic development. Governor Pritzker has enacted multiple pieces of legislation over his tenure to establish Illinois as a real leader in this space. The successes include a statewide goal for 100% clean energy, implementation of a climate curriculum in public schools, so the students that are coming to us will come with a richer set of experiences, creation of thousands of new green jobs, and the establishment of standards for carbon capture, safety, and protection. So we are thrilled to have him here with us today, and please join me in welcoming the Governor to the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you for the very kind welcome. Good afternoon to everybody. It's great to be back here. I feel like this may be in my third or fourth time just in the last few months, and it is always a great welcome. So appreciate that. It's an honor to be here for the launch of this institute. This is very special. And the idea that it's happening here at UChicago, that you are once again on the cutting edge, is frankly a moment of great pride for the governor of a state that has a great institution like this in it. You, of course, the research and policy infrastructure that you're building are important for the world, but also for us as a state, and especially because you're discussing and making decisions about and engaging in the future of our planet. I first want to thank the leadership team here at UChicago, always welcoming and always here at these events, who have once again put this world-class university at the center of one of the most important policy conversations that we could have. And of course, that's President Paul Alivisatos, Provost Kate Baker, thank you very much. Institute Director Michael Greenstone, thank you for your leadership. I also see in the audience here our senior senator and somebody who has been carrying climate legislation and been an environmental advocate for as long as I can remember, and that's our great senior senator, Dick Durbin. For decades, this campus has been an incubator of world-changing advancements in science and economics and public policy, three disciplines that are absolutely critical in the fight against climate change. If we are to meet our climate goals as well as our energy needs, we will need scientific discovery and technological innovations deployed at a scale and pace never before seen in our history. The Institute of Climate and Sustainable Growth will be a place for leading academics, students, and policymakers to wrestle with the fundamental questions that will determine our future. These are questions that my administration has tried to grapple with, well, plenty over the last 5.5 years since I took office. Climate change represents one of the most significant challenges that our people and our planet have ever faced, maybe the most important. Already we are experiencing the consequences of human action or inaction, extreme temperatures, intensifying natural disasters, resource shortages. And just to be clear, as governor of a state, I am directly responsible for responding to many of those things with our National Guard, with the resources we have in our Illinois Emergency Management Agency, and so on. Our response to this crisis will impact future generations, likely more than any other single issue. Success or failure in this pursuit will dictate whether we'll have clean air and water at all, whether we'll continue to face increasingly calamitous natural disasters, whether we'll be able to live and raise our families as we have in the past. Just to point out to many of you who may not be from Chicago, or those from Chicago didn't know this, but we sit on the shores of and on top of 20% of the world's surface fresh water in the state of Illinois, 20% of the world's surface fresh water. So we are the protectors in many ways. Of course, the other states that surround Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes are too, but we have a special responsibility. We have aquifers across the state, rivers throughout the state. You know, I was just in Arizona, Nevada, Colorado. They're grappling with where are they going to get their water from. And honestly, I'm saying, look some other direction. We've got ours. We all have to think about how we're going to preserve and enhance the safety of the fresh water that we have. That entire endeavor of the challenge that we face, that this institute is addressing, should feel daunting, because it is daunting. Therefore, we have a responsibility to craft our response with the ambition and urgency that this crisis requires. It's important also to say that at the same time the climate crisis must be addressed for how it might negatively affect our future, it also presents an opportunity that serves to motivate people in the present. With a motivation of this scale and the resources that it requires, we can fundamentally improve our world today. We are building up industries that drive growth and prosperity for our people. We can make our communities more, well, convenient and livable. We can drive technological advancements that dramatically improve quality of life. And that's all while addressing the challenge of climate change. With the urgency that climate change requires, the Illinois General Assembly and I have advanced an ambitious energy and environmental policy agenda, pledging to utilize the levers at our disposal to meet this moment. We brought together competing stakeholders, energy producers, unions, environmentalists, and we listened to scientists and researchers to craft one of the boldest clean energy laws in the entire nation, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA. Already, it has caused the replacement of fossil fuel generating energy and transportation across the state. We only passed it in 2021, and it's incentivized tens of billions of dollars in private investment in renewable and clean energy deployment. In just the last few years, Illinois has more than doubled our renewable production and reached nearly 2/3 clean energy generation in the state of Illinois. That's a big deal. And it's something that I brag about as I travel the world promoting the state of Illinois, that we have made enormous progress. We started with an awful lot, I must say, but we now are making progress every single year that is worthy of calling out. But we're not stopping there. The legislature and I understand, as you all do, that every fraction of a percent reduction in planetary warming represents billions of dollars in savings for our economy, and I say our meaning the state of Illinois and the country more broadly, and likely it means saving thousands of lives. We have an obligation to leverage as much as possible our creativity and innovation toward our climate goals. That principle powered our passage of nation-leading legislation in other areas, often untouched by climate discussion. It was mentioned just a few minutes ago, like carbon capture, sequestration, and sustainable aviation fuel. We can all debate about, what the efficacy of all these things are over the long run and whether they're sustainable for, 100 years or decades. But they're an important piece of what we all ought to be addressing and iterating around in order to make progress here. And in the spirit of this institute, we focused on areas of sustainable growth. I have long rejected the idea that climate policy must necessarily come at the expense of economic opportunity. To the contrary, if we're going to meet our climate goals in a reasonable amount of time, we will need to incentivize growth. We will need policies that leverage public capital with private capital, drive innovation, and fuel our entrepreneurial spirit. We will need to keep people engaged in the new energy economy, creating good jobs, building a skilled workforce for it, and revitalizing communities that through climate-focused industrial growth. We have left too many communities behind over the years not addressing climate justice, and that is also an important piece of what we need to do over the coming years, and I know this institute will be engaged in. Those are some of the principles that are driving our vision for a fossil fuel-free future. And while I'm proud of the progress that we've made so far, we have a lot of work ahead of us. We have our work cut out for us, which is why I'm really glad that we'll have institutions like this institute to help us get there. This is a place where the brightest minds in the field will come together from around the world and from right here in Chicago to drive world-altering progress. A place where no stone will be left unturned, I'm sure, in the fight against climate change. A place where our future will be built as we build it together. I'm very proud to be governor of a state where we will work together to make this kind of positive change and where we will have an institute that will help us lead the way. Thank you all very much.
So Thank you, Governor Pritzker, for your support of the Institute, for your support of the university, for all that you do for the people of Illinois. I feel like he really gets us. So thank you for all of that. If you have been following the news lately, you've of course seen all of the activity and progress for climate policy at the federal level at the U.S., but also appreciate how much more there is to be done. Illinois Senator Dick Durbin has been a long-standing champion of climate policy in the Senate and an advocate for other common-sense federal laws that would slow the rate of carbon emissions and protect against the impact of the climate crisis. As a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee and the Senate's second-ranking Democrat, Senator Durbin has worked to secure robust funding for researchers at the national labs and universities across Illinois, thus supporting groundbreaking scientific advancements in energy and climate change. And we're very lucky to have him as an advocate for that. We're incredibly grateful to you for being here today, and please join me in welcoming Senator Durbin to the podium.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I got a good speech here, but I'm not going to give it. Just tell you a couple stories. First story, a faculty member here at the University of Chicago in 1942 ran for the Democratic nomination for the United States Senate. He was on the city council of the city of Chicago. He was the one independent alderman out of 50. He lost in that primary. The day after he lost in the primary in 1942, he left the faculty of the University of Chicago and enlisted in the Marine Corps. His name was Paul Douglas. He still holds the record as the oldest recruit in the history of the Marine Corps. He was 50 years old. He went through basic training at Parris Island, came out with a war injury, a serious war injury, lost the use of his left arm. And eventually, in 1948, ran successfully for the United States Senate. I was an intern in his office as a college student. That's when I first thought I might be interested in politics. It goes back a few years. He had a lot of projects. He was a brilliant man, a PhD in economics and such. But he also had some local interest. He once said, when I was a young man, I wanted to save the world. When I was elected to the Senate, I wanted to save the United States. At the end of my career in the Senate, I just want to save the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. He did. He did it despite the opposition of the entire Indiana delegation, the steel mills and everybody else. He achieved that goal. The second person I want to mention to you is a former senator, preceded me in the Senate, named Paul Simon. Paul Simon was an extraordinary man. He never graduated from college, but wrote a dozen or more books, maybe 20 books during the course of his professional lifetime. One of his last books was not a great seller, but it still was a very interesting book, and it was entitled Tapped Out. And it was his speculation that in the 21st century, many of the battles around the world will be fought over clean, drinkable water. That was an observation by this man that turned out to be eminently true. So I'm lucky to stand before you as a senator from this state and to have two Pauls in my background, to be in the Senate seat that Paul Douglas once held, to have served as his intern, and also to have come out of law school and gone to work for Paul Simon. The point I want to make to you, and I'm sure everybody in this room feels it just as intensely as I do, is we are at a cusp of a turning point in this country in 6 days. The question is, where are we going as a nation? We have two extraordinary people who were here earlier. I see they stepped out maybe because I was speaking. Oh no, they're in the front row. Heidi Heidkamp, God bless her. So good to see you, my colleague. And sitting next to her, John Podesta, a Chicagoan you probably all know, who in his own capacity has done more on the environmental scene in Washington than almost any single person. I'm glad to see both of you here today. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what's going to happen after next Tuesday? I don't know the answer to that, and the experts don't either. But here's what I do know. If the blockheads who believe that climate change is a hoax prevail, we're going to be set back I don't know how badly or how long. But they would look at what we're doing today and say it's a waste of time and money to create this institute. They have a different view of the challenge, if there is one, and a different view of the solution. I think they're dead wrong. I think the overwhelming consensus among science, credible science in this world, lets us know that we're at a turning point, a critical moment when it comes to the future of this planet and what we do with it. We need a global effort, not just a US effort, but a global effort. But we have to be in the leadership of that effort. The fact that we have such prodigious energy resources and create such a large part of the challenge gives us no choice but to be part of it. This administration, the Biden administration, passed legislation through Congress to appropriate, I think, $369 million for this effort to go underway, whether it's in hydrogen, solar, whatever it happens to be, to reduce our dependence on carbon generation fuel. We need to continue that and move into the future. And if we're going to have a successful future, a rewarding future that moves us in the right direction, we've got to take the issue of climate change and look at it more carefully. I can't think of a better place to do it than starting right here at the University of Chicago. This institute is going to create an opportunity for the first undergraduate degree in this field, as was described earlier. And it's going to give us a chance to continue in this leadership that this university has shown over the years. It's been an honor to represent you, and I'm going to continue to, and I want to make sure on the appropriation committee that the resources you need will be available. Thank you very much for letting me say hello to them.
So thank you, Senator Durbin, for your support of the Institute and of the university and for making sure that those resources can help scholars and students drive forward. We will now have a series of fireside chats to dive deeper into each of the pillars that you heard described, and we're going to move straight forward into that because I know there's a lot of programming left. In line with President Olivasado's aspirations for the University of Chicago as a whole, the Institute is really focused on breaking down silos. We will make more progress together because of the breadth of expertise present at the university, which not every university can boast, and we are very lucky to bring that interdisciplinary panoply to bear. We need partnerships with leaders driving climate policy, sitting in rooms where decisions are made. And so our first fireside chat is going to be with about economics and policies that surround climate change policy opportunities. And we have some amazing people to bring to the front. The first is John Podesta. He's Senior Advisor to President Biden for international climate policy, and he's really on the front line of climate action on a global scale. I understand he joins us from a trip to Beijing, coming right back, so thank you for staying awake for this. And this was part of the lead up to the submission of the new climate pledges under the Paris Agreement, including the US and China. For decades in the White House, first as Chief of Staff to President Clinton, then counsel to President Obama on climate, energy, and policy, and now with his role in the Biden administration, he's laid the groundwork for some of the most significant initiatives in history, from the Paris Agreement to the Inflation Reduction Act. So he will bring that wealth of experience to the conversation. Moderating the conversation is our very own former US Senator Heidi Heitkamp. Her career-long focus has been on providing equal economic opportunity for rural Americans. And as a senator, she worked to responsibly harness North Dakota's energy resources and successfully pushed to lift a 40-year ban on exporting US crude oil while expanding support for renewable energy. So these goals don't need to be in conflict. She's navigated a lot of tensions in policy between climate action, energy access, and economic growth, just as the Institute will focus on doing. As public servants, John and Heidi are really well versed in the politics as well as the practical implementation of these important issues at the federal, state, and international levels. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. They'll be joined by Michael Greenstone on stage. So I invite you all to the stage now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. As you've heard, I represented a state called North Dakota. We have a lot of energy, renewable energy, but also a lot of fossil energy. And my job when I was in the United States Senate was trying to balance those two interests. And now my job at the Institute of Politics is to try and encourage young people to see things through a different lens, to think about the challenges that we have and how do we become persuasive in those challenges from a different perspective. And so I want you all to imagine yourself listening to this discussion if you were Boilermakers in a power plant in North Dakota. What would you believe would be practical? What would you believe would be to your benefit in this climate discussion? Because as Dick just said, and I just want to say this as a personal privilege, Dick Durbin is one of the most principled, practical, amazing senators in the United States Senate. You guys should be so proud, especially if you're from Chicago. You don't see him a lot on television, but his impact is huge. And so Dick told you that we're going to decide whether we are headed towards a sustainable climate policy in this country, where people actually think this is a problem that needs to be tackled. But the most important thing that we can do, and I think the brilliance of this institute will be the fact that you have added sustainable growth. Not just what we can do in terms of practice, but is it possible to balance those two interests and come up with policies and come up with public opinion and I think sustainable policy that people go, yeah, that works for me. And just I will tell you that our policy in this country on climate has been full of goodies, lots of carrots and few sticks. I mean, that's just where we are. And so I want to start out by asking John, who has been in this world for a long time and just an absolute clear voice on the threat. In your job of advancing policies and looking at sustainability, how difficult has it been to tell people that we can have both, that we can have sustainable growth and also a climate policy that addresses what so many people here believe is an existential threat?
Look, I think that's a question for people all across the planet, as Michael suggested in laying down and by the way, congratulations on the Institute. It's really an amazing achievement. That's the question for everyone. And I think in our administration, President Biden, Vice President Harris thought they had an answer to that, which is that by supporting an investment-led strategy to transform the economy from one that's powered by polluting fossil fuels to one that's built on clean energy across every sector, not just power, but transportation, buildings, agriculture and forestry, as well as industrial processes, we could produce both strong growth, strong investment, strong business creation, and strong job growth. And I think the proof's in the pudding. We've seen $450 billion worth of clean energy investments announced in the United States since they came into office. Most of that since the Inflation Reduction Act has been passed. Again, it's spread across the entire country, north, south, east, west. We're seeing a renaissance in manufacturing here in the U.S. And I think what's happened as a result of saying we can tackle this problem, we can transform our economy, we can decarbonize it through an investment-led strategy, is we've seen other countries follow suit. So in Japan, they passed what's called GX. In Europe, it's the Green Industrial Strategy. You know, across the world, I think people are looking to do what we absolutely need to do as a society, which is to go from highly polluting fossil fuels to transition away, to use the COP Dubai term, to clean forms of energy. And the one thing I would quibble with him, and then I'll let him have some time back, is Michael said that fossil fuels are still the cheapest form of energy. That's increasing. Many places. That's increasingly not true in the electricity sector, where solar has become cheaper than fossils in most places. And that's why you saw, for the first time, the U.S. new generation the majority was in solar power here. That's happening across the world. And it doesn't account for your primary research, which is the cost of inaction. And we're seeing that take place with the 20 million children in southern Africa who are experiencing malnutrition from extreme drought, the fires in the Amazon and the Pantanal, what we talked about in the U.S., the hurricanes here, the fires in the West. If you do what you told us to do, look at that social cost of carbon, then I think the balance comes heavily on the side of clean.
And do you want to respond to just the...
Well, sure. Let me just start by saying what an honor it is to be on a panel with you, Senator Heitkamp, and with John, whose career I have followed closely and always wondered, are there like actually 3 Johns? And his, particularly both of your willingness to engage in the details, at least from an academic's perspective, amazing. Honor to be here. So, look, what is the core problem? I like to come back to that. The core problem is, and we can argue about in how many settings and how many places, fossil fuels still remain less expensive than the alternative low carbon energy sources. And I know of only 2 ways to fix that problem. One, I was so glad to hear John make a loud and vociferous argument for carbon tax. By having fossil fuels pay their full freight, their full damages, as John articulated, which, by the way, that's a choice that we don't do that. You would level the playing field. They would no longer be subsidized. And our choices would be totally different. So one thing that I've done a little work on is if you really took account of that, nuclear, which kind of looks like barely hanging on, you have to pass special policies for it to keep it going, like nuclear would look like a great option. Current nuclear technology, not even the ones coming down the line. So option 1 is to find a way to level the playing field by making fossil fuels pay their full costs. And it currently, in most parts of the world, it is a construction, our choice, that we don't do that. And I don't think we should be allowed to be surprised at the consequences.
We do the opposite. We subsidize fossil fuels.
That's right.
The other way is, if we think that that's politically very challenging, which it has proven to be in many settings, would be, I guess I'm looking at Shirley, would be to find some way to make the low carbon energy sources less expensive so that even though they're competing with one arm tied behind their back, they have a way to be competitive with the fossils. And I think that will require enormous investments in kind of basic research and technology so that we find things that we don't know yet. And that's, of course, something that universities want to do.
And not just on cost, Shirley, but also on redundancy and reliability. Intermittency with renewables is a huge challenge and remains a huge challenge. And the work that you're doing, and I think if you're out there supporting this work, I want to tell you how critically important that piece is. And so can't wait to hear your discussion. But I want to go back to this idea that we're on a trajectory of investment, and all things are going to be rosy in the future. We're going to have an election. A lot of folks have said, I am going to repeal and we know you don't even need to repeal it, you just need to slow it down, not spend the money. The Inflation Reduction Act, we have a Senate Ag Committee that is trying to roll back some of the conservation agricultural provisions. And we don't have a country that is united.
House Ag.
Yeah, House, yeah. I said House.
Oh,
I know which side that is. Well, never mind. Anyway, so I think that when you have a whole plan that's based on private investment, but you don't have certainty, you don't have predictability in your policies. So let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is supported by many fossil companies. In fact, many of the large oil companies have said they would not ask that it be repealed, but yet it has become a whipping horse, in part because it was Biden's policy. But talk about whether you think the Inflation Reduction Act, number one, is good policy on Michael's part, but also sustainable policy in terms of investment.
You go first. You know it better than
Well, first of all, I think that as I said, you've seen this tremendous reaction from the private sector, and they're now developing projects, plans, factories, deployment of renewables that have changed, I think, the politics. So I think the one thing that's actually quite sticky in our climate policy, which is debated between the two parties, is in fact this investment-led Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's quite popular in red states and blue. There's a greater investment in red states and red districts than in blue states. You saw 18 Republican members write a letter to the Speaker in August saying, don't repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. We're relying on this for jobs in our district. So I think that there's still ideology in the system, and you know, in my current role, I can't really talk about politics, but at least one of the candidates is saying, you know, continues, as the senator noted, to call climate change a hoax. You can do with that what you will. But I think it's pretty sticky. I think it's the rest of the climate agenda that is really susceptible to change and to movement. Michael suggests that we do nothing to kind of price carbon. In fact, I think we do. There is carbon pricing in the U.S. We just implemented a new fee on methane from the production of oil and gas,
which has been stayed by the courts,
and
right?
I think no.
Oh, not that one. Just the rule for BLM.
But I think that the other thing that's been a hallmark of this administration is to use the authorities we have under the Clean Air Act to directly reduce carbon through regulation. So whether that's in the power sector, in transportation, through the tailpipe emission standards, you could call that a kind of proxy price or whatever, but it's a direct intervention to reduce emissions from emitting sectors, and that has consequences. That's why we have cleaner air than we've had in the past, and that balance is at issue because I think if past this prologue, what we saw in the previous administration was the attempt to roll back a lot of the environmental protections that have been put in place by the Obama administration.
So let me make a couple points. First, on the IRA, one thing that I think has not quite received enough attention that is really remarkable. On the tax credits, it was quite, did a very good job of, I think, being as technology neutral as possible. And one thing, and I want to connect that to the innovation that the world so desperately needs, is if you took the IRA policy and implemented it, I'm going to make up a number, let's call it 10 years ago, actually it probably would not, of the tax credits, it would not have passed a cost-benefit test in the sense that the reductions in carbon would have cost more than the reduction in climate damages. But what is remarkable is the improvements in solar and wind and in batteries in the last decade have now taken these technologies, which are competing on a largely uneven playing field, and turned that into like a socially positive thing. It's getting reductions in tons. They're less expensive than, if you totally wonk out, less expensive than the social cost of carbon. And so I think that's been an excellent part, and I think that part is probably very stable and almost, I don't know, I'm curious John's view, but probably immune to the election.
Yeah, I think that's right. The other thing that I think, and one of the reasons for the change in politics a little bit, is I think the president was very thoughtful in saying that we want growth, we want investment, we want it in these clean technologies, but we care about where it happens too. Yeah. And so there are incentives in the bill and in the structure of the credits that Michael was talking about to ensure that the jobs that are created are good paying jobs by giving a 5x bonus for paying prevailing wage, using certified apprentices, et cetera, that you can create a career out of. And the credits that, the enhancement of the credit to invest in traditional energy communities, in disadvantaged communities, has meant, and there's plenty now of Treasury analysis to show that that's had a significant impact to move investment to places that have often felt left out and left behind during the course of the
And
transition.
I think it's important when you think about this piece, and I know the president was highly supportive, but this bill was written by Joe Manchin. And it was written so that states that are in transition can be really active and really push a big benefit. Michael, you want to add?
Yeah, and then I just, I think John thought I was being sharp with him about carbon pricing. That was not actually my point. I mean,
Sure it was.
we could do that, but I thought I was being sly. But I'm a big believer in the regulatory machine, and the regulatory machine can be used quite effectively. It has to be done sector by sector. It's obviously less efficient than having an economy-wide carbon price, and I think there's been a lot of great work in updating the social cost of carbon and that allowing for stricter regulation. But really what I was pointing to was not the U.S. It was a global statement I was making. And so one question that I would kind of have for John is, it's super important that the United States begin to make progress, but it is also true that 2023 and I think 2024 are record years for CO2 emissions globally. And so that's, I want to come back to, it has to be the case that people are willing to make this choice. And
I want to transition to the global, but first I want to challenge John a little bit on his statement that the Clean Air Act is a vehicle for controlling carbon. I'm not convinced that's true anymore in wake of the reversal of Chevron. I'm not sure it's true with the new Supreme Court that we have, even though in the past they have, in fact, read an expansive view of the Clean Air Act. So let's just agree to put a pin in that one, John, and suggest that maybe we need to revisit the role that the Clean Air Act can play in carbon restrictions. Let's turn globally, because I will tell you, as someone who was there when the Paris Agreement was signed, I had tons of Republican senators coming to me asking me to basically sign on with them on a resolution saying this was a treaty and not appropriate, and why should we do it all when the rest of the world is where the growth in CO2 emissions is coming. And so this is a political atmosphere that we're still active in and still participating in. So how do you best respond on the role that the United States can play globally in addressing that balance of sustainability with climate control?
Well, look, obviously, particularly the large developing economies, particularly China, China accounts for 30% of global emissions. Yeah. India is the third largest emitter in the world now. So if everybody needs to be in the game, and you asked, though, specifically about the United States and that moment, I think one of the things that President Obama deserves credit for was in 2014, the year before Paris was signed, going to Beijing, we worked on an agreement with the Chinese to say, in the construct of a nationally determined commitment to reduce emissions or to stabilize emissions, that they did a joint, President Xi and President Obama made that announcement. That really was the spark that led to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is built around a different structure than the previous Kyoto Protocol, which the United States could never ratify. It is built around a national framework and transparency and accountability to the global system. So that's the framework we're operating in, and we need everybody to participate. Last year, we had a successful outcome in the Conference of Parties in Dubai, and the countries of the world agreed to come forward with, first of all, to transition away from fossil fuels. That was a major breakthrough, first time that's happened. And then to come forward with 2035 nationally determined commitments, NDCs, that were economy-wide, 1.5 aligned, and covered all greenhouse gases. So the question is, those are due in February. The question is, will countries actually come forward in doing that? That's where I'm running around the world now, trying to convince the rest of the world that we're going to do our part. That depends a little bit on what happens in 6 days. And we're going to come forward with a commitment, as the president did in 2021 for 2030. We're going to update that, but also that they need to do it. In the case of China, for example, they made a pledge back then in 2014 to install 1,200 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030. They met that deadline 6 years ahead of schedule. They did it this year. And we're pressing them to say that they have essentially peaked in their emissions. They need to show real cuts by 2035 on the order of 30%. But we're going to be able to judge that when people come forward. And I feel pretty good about the discussions we're having with the EU, with Japan, with the Republic of Korea, with Brazil, with Indonesia. But there's an elephant in the room, which is what's China going to do?
Yeah, that I would tell you, in crisis, when you think the natural gas isn't going to come from Russia, maybe you start up your coal-fired power plants again if you're Germany, right? And so,
they didn't do that.
Right, but these economic challenges add to, they make a difference in the prioritization of climate goals.
Sure.
And so, Michael, that's really what you're getting at with this institute, is trying to figure out how do you create an energy an energy world where the sustainability of that is built on acceptance that we can in fact do this and still grow. And so how do you respond to countries that say, you put up the chart, right, on how many megawatts of energy or kilowatts of energy one person uses in India compared to this country, and then you're going to go tell India you have to get on board and on the climate train and reduce your emissions. How do you do that when we look like we're we've built our economy, now you get to curtail yours?
Yeah, so I have a mix of reactions. First, let me say, it's like a talking point inside universities. Oh, these climate agreements are voluntary, and then they kind of wah, and oh, they don't mean anything. I actually think I have a much more glass half full version of that. And one thing I'll say, John's been very modest. That 2014 agreement with China, is my understanding, absolutely would not have happened without him. And then, like domino, that caused the Paris thing. And so he deserves a lot of credit for that. But what I want to underscore, what comes out of those negotiations that's so important, is when China cuts a ton, or India or Bangladesh cuts a ton, they're doing a favor to us. They're providing benefits to us. And that's kind of the game of the international negotiations. Like, cutting in isolation is kind of missing the larger picture. The larger picture is, we want to do cuts because guys will maybe do 6 or 7 tons in exchange for one of our tons, and that will provide benefits that has reduced climate damages for the United States. And so I think that dynamic should not be lost. Now, let me pick a little bit I think it's your question and the kind of wah that exists inside academia sometimes about this is, these climate agreements are voluntary. And so there's really, I think, a limited range of ways to make them not voluntary. The Europeans are experimenting with border tariff adjustments. That's one thing you could do. You could have, you could actually use all tariffs as a kind of very blunt instrument. That would be kind of a second thing to do. And then a third would be, I think, the rich countries, and picking up on the graph, which obviously stuck with you, Heidi. I love that you love graphs. Is like, well, if it's so meaningful to us, maybe we would be willing to put money in a fund in exchange for reductions from other countries who find the current situation unfair. And so I'm very curious to hear John's views on kind of beginning to put teeth on these agreements and what the prospects for that might look like, where everyone would want to participate.
Interestingly enough, Sheldon Whitehouse, along with Bill Cassidy, Sheldon's from Rhode Island, and absolutely the leader in the Senate on climate. Bill Cassidy, Republican senator from Illinois, or from Louisiana, have both introduced climate border adjustment bills. And so that is one idea that has gone from academics to actual discussion. But we only have a few minutes, but I want to raise this, give you a number. I recently read a number that one Google search, just using the search engine in Google, if you did that same thing using AI, it would use 10 times more power. What we haven't talked about here is this mammoth growth in the demand for energy that is going to come with the AI revolution. And so we think we have a manageable cohort here of what energy we're going to need. It is going to explode if, in fact, the AI economy explodes. How do you deal with that, both of you?
I see Calvin over there. He's going to come in and explain that. Look, we've lived for almost a generation with flat load in the United States. I mean, there's been a lot of increase in growth, et cetera, but it's been managed by more efficiency in the system. Now we're seeing a big spike in demand for electricity in particular. That's coming from data centers. It's coming from AI. It's going to increase from 3% to maybe 9% in the course of this decade of total electricity consumption. We're seeing it from electrification of transportation. We're seeing it from electrification of buildings. So there are a lot of drivers of growth. The question is, are we going to build that out clean? And are we going to have a grid that can support that kind of load growth? Those are big challenges, but I think it is possible, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're responsive to that. We've kind of got a balkanized regulatory system in the United States that's based on states and regions, not on national policy, but we're doing everything we can to build out transmission, to use advanced technologies in the grid, to build out more clean power, to do it where there's already interconnection, to get rid of the long interconnection queues through incentives and regulation. And by the way, to use AI, we just did a convening at the White House yesterday. It already seems like a week ago, between the providers and some of the companies about how we can use AI to improve the performance of actually getting clean resources online.
Michael?
You know, I think I like John's answer quite a bit. What I would say is there can be a tendency sometimes, maybe in the historical press sometimes, about shaming particular forms of energy consumption. I think in general, energy consumption produces benefits that are great for society. And if they don't, you know, that form of consumption will go away. And so like if the AI search is not outproducing the regular Google search over time, we'll stop doing it that way. And so I want to come back to, which I'm bastardizing John's version into the way I want to describe it, which is the challenge is, are we creating the conditions where the low carbon energy sources are going to be less expensive, be it through getting rid of transmission constraints or through pricing or through tax incentives or whatever it is? That's the core question in my view. And not all policies are going to be good ideas there, but I think a lot of them are.
I think, though, one of the core questions is, even if you could demonstrate that, do you have the public will to make those transitions? And that's the challenge that we have today, which is trying to find the ability or the kind of public will. I mean, I think all politics is, you know, I think people have this idea that, you know, Jim Inhofe throws a snowball on the floor of the Senate and says there's no such thing as global warming, and that somehow is a policy statement. That's not a policy statement. In many of these states, a lot of the aversion to making this transition doesn't come from somebody's ideological, you know, kind of idea, you know, sense. It comes from what they're hearing from their constituency. And, you know, Michael, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. If I'm, you know, running my car on gasoline, I go up to the pump and I know what that costs. If I'm doing a Google search, I don't know what that costs in terms of energy. I'm removed from that connection as consumer or as worker from the cost of energy. And I think that that's been a real challenge. And the thing that the consumers hear repeatedly is, if we make this transition, it will cost me more. And you could point to Colorado, where they actually did some work in low-income families who are hit harder by higher cost, energy costs, ended up doing homework by candlelight. I can show you the article and the story. So how do you bring the public along with the urgency of climate, but also convince them that this will in fact be economically viable for them and affordable for them?
So, in the beauty of the classroom and the blackboard, I would describe this, there is a redistribution problem here, which is that...
You got to remember, these are all power plant workers now. They're all Boilermakers.
Oh, sorry, let me try and say it in English. The higher energy costs hurt some people more than others. There's no question about that. And I think trying to find policies that don't choose to ignore that, but take that very seriously in front and center, finding ways to rebate money to those families, or lead to economic development in the areas where there's concentrations of people who are going to be hurt. I think that's a totally legitimate thing to do. And that also, of course, has to be balanced with what I would say the benefits you're getting from it. If we could stop the carbon emissions, that's going to produce a safer place for our children and their children. And that's a hard message, I understand, because it's not today. But.
Right.
Well, look, I think you have to directly attack the problem you're raising, Heidi. I think we've done that through rebates and through tax incentives to buy energy-efficient appliances, to do whole home retrofits. In the end of the day, last year, 3.5 million families took advantage of that to the tune of $8 billion worth of tax savings. That saves money twice, because they're putting in that equipment with some cost savings on their tax bill, and then they have long-term savings on their energy bill. But we need to take account of the real world and keep support. The one thing I would say, a little bit different than the experience with the Affordable Care Act, the support for clean energy, notwithstanding the politics, has stayed relatively stable and relatively high across the political spectrum and across the country. So I think people want cleaner alternatives. There's been a lot of reporting on the uptake in electric vehicles. It's a little bit slower than some people predicted, but it's still going up pretty fast. It's now last year it was 18% plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles of total sales in the US. In China, it's 50%. So, I think the life cycle savings for people are real, and that's why people are moving towards thinking about those choices. We've got still lots of problems to solve, charging, et cetera, but I think people want to go in this direction.
Well, I want to thank both of you. We're out of time, but this is such an important discussion. But I think that the reason why this is the opening dialogue is because it recognizes that you can't just be interested and concerned about climate. You've got to figure out how we can reach that balance. And Michael, I really applaud you and the president and the university for tackling this. John, you are a champion. We are so fortunate here at the University of Chicago to have you. And if I made you all Boilermakers, you now can go back to being somebody who you are. And good luck to all of you, and good luck to the new endeavor. Thank you.
We'll take just a minute or two break for people to stretch their legs as need be, and then we'll proceed to the next panel.
program will be starting shortly. Please take your seats and direct your attention to the stage. Thank you.
We're going to try to resume soon. If I can ask you all to take your seats. There's obviously a lot to discuss in what we've seen already, and there will be lots of opportunities to continue discussing. I know I learned a great deal from the first panel. Like Michael, I am an economist who's done a tour through public policy, so while I would like to think that if we just get the prices and the taxes right, everything will be fine, it turns out policymakers also have to think about politics. So it's wonderful to hear the work that the Institute is going to be doing to help bridge those divides. But of course, as Michael said, central to every discussion on climate crisis is society's need for clean, reliable, affordable energy. How do we decarbonize major sectors like transportation and the grid? How do we make renewables available 24 hours a day? How do we make cars that'll go 400 miles between charges? Energy storage is crucial to all of those solutions. And the Institute's Energy Technologies Initiative, led by Shirley Mung, will help to answer these essential questions. So in addition to her role at Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering, she's also chief scientist at Argonne Collaborative Center for Energy Storage Sciences, and as you heard, was recently appointed director of the Battery Hub, or the Energy Storage Research Alliance, through the Department of Energy. So that is a wonderful opportunity for all of us to advance something so crucial to the world. She's going to be joined on stage by two leaders in this space. Calvin Butler is CEO of Exelon, the nation's largest utility. Under Calvin's leadership, Exelon is driving forward a clean energy transition centered on equity, which builds up the economic health and employment of local communities at the same time. And Paul DeBar, who is currently CEO of Bohr Quantum Technology. From 2017 to 2021, he served as Undersecretary for Science at the Department of Energy. He's a graduate of the Naval Academy, and he served as a managing director at J.P. Morgan. So no one is better placed than Shirley, Calvin, and Paul to speak to us about energy technology and innovation and how these new technologies might play out in practice, which is that intersection where the Institute is going to make major contributions. Their moderator will be Amy Harder, formerly UChicago Epic Journalism Fellow and founding executive of Cipher News, a breakthrough energy initiative. So please join me in welcoming all of them to the stage.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is it coming through? Great. Well, thank you, Kate, for that introduction, and thank you to the whole UChicago team for putting on this incredible event. I wish I could go back in time and take some of those classes. Maybe I can sit in on them to do some continued learning. And thank you all to everyone joining here in person and those of you on the live stream as well. I want to kick it off actually with a question to throw out to you in the audience before we dive back into our panel. Raise your hand if you think we need new technologies to tackle climate change. So that was somewhat of a trick question to make the point that whether we like it or not, we will need a whole host of new technologies and scaling current technologies to tackle climate change, build out renewable energy, and over time transition away from fossil fuels. We've convened an esteemed panel today that Kate already introduced to talk about these different technologies, what the university's new institute is leading on this front, with, of course, a particular focus on batteries. Contrary to the reality outside, it's not always windy, and we still need energy when it's not windy or sunny. So Shirley, I want to throw it to you first. Set the scene for us on energy storage in particular. Why is it so important to the energy transition, and where do we need to go from here to get it to where we need to be to sufficiently address climate change?
Thank you, Amy. So let me first say I'm deeply humbled here. We have Paul sitting next to me. When he was in the Office of Science, DOE, he funded a lot of the foundational work at Argonne about next generation batteries. And then we have CEO from Exelon who actually put a lot of these technology into practices. So I'm really humbled to be here to share my views. So I think Senator Heidi already said very well the intermittency nature of the low carbon source energies like wind and solar represents this huge challenge that how can we stabilize the grid. And we also recognize that in the transportation sectors, energy storage already played a pivotal role in terms of displacing some fossil consumption. So I just want to paint a picture here for everyone. Imagine if you have a battery that will last for 50 years. I know it's hard for you to imagine now, but with technology innovation, imagine that. And then imagine a battery that made with no critical elements, no lithium, no copper, no cobalt, no nickel. And that's entirely possible thanks to some of the earlier work that the Department of Energy have funded. Also, imagine that your batteries, whatever materials you use in the battery, that can be recycled 99.9%, just like the lead acid batteries. So with all those technology innovations coming on our way, we project the future energy storage cost can be lowered from today's more than 10 cents to 1 to 3 cents. And that's the goal that we have promised the Department of Energy. You know, of course, the hub I led have 45 top scientists from all over the United States. We, as a team, together with about 80 students and the graduate students, are working towards those goals. So the goal is really, you know, with innovation in material science and processing science and recycling science, we will be able to make energy storage technologies to the cost where each kilowatt hour you amortize is only 1 to 3 cents. So I hope a few years later, you come back and check the fact. We need some time.
Wow, 50 years. I would love to not have to charge my phone for 50 years. So I will definitely keep close tabs on that. Calvin, I want to turn to you and then come back to Paul. Calvin, you're really at the intersection of where the rubber hits the road on this topic. So I would love to hear from you about your perspective about how integrating battery storage onto the grid is going, and to kind of continue the conversation that Senator Heitkamp brought up in the last panel, how is AI supercharging these debates?
So first off, let me begin by saying thank you and congratulations to the University of Chicago and all that you're doing in terms of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth, because everything that you've been talking about is my world. And I say that in all seriousness. I'll give you an example. Having an earnings call this morning, and probably 80% of those calls were focused on the growth that's happening across the country in terms of artificial intelligence, data center growth. I think we heard John even say it may go 3 to 8 times the growth. And what happens so often is that we talk in terms of climate or sustainable growth. And it really has to be an and. And then you put where I, as you said, sitting at the intersection of all of this, it's about can we deliver safe, reliable, and affordable power? Because you don't have an energy transformation if everyone isn't transitioning. You can't leave out the west side of Chicago and just ensure that downtown Chicago is taken care of, or that Hinsdale is all good. You have to focus on everyone, or the transition really never occurs. So that equitable component is key. And technology is going to play a major part in there. And not just technology for technology's sake, it has to be affordable technology. And I think that's how we get there. So I'll give you a real example. You heard of Exelon, and most of you know it as ComEd, the owner of ComEd. But we own 5 other utilities across the United States, and they all represent large urban areas, coastal regions, and rural. The energy transformation is different to each one of them. And I think someone said it earlier when they talked about you have to have the right market conditions to encourage the right incentives to get this done. What's happening in the United States is that we want a 21st century grid, but we're still playing by 19th century rules. We're still expecting to get there with what we've been doing for the last 30 to 40 years, and you won't get there. You talked about the transmission build-out. It should not take 2 years to even site a transmission line. But you won't get clean energy, distributed energy resources in place until you get the transmission system built up. So that's the tension. But if you don't have institutes like this to have the conversation, it'll never happen.
That's great, and we're going to come back and unpack a bit of that in a moment. Paul, I want to turn to you. I think we've heard a couple of different perspectives from the Democratic side of the ledger here already. As some of you might have heard, we have somewhat of an important election coming up in a few days. Senator Durbin said earlier that if a certain candidate were to win, that he would want to get rid of all of this. Could you give us your perspective on some of the comments that you've heard already today, coming as somebody who did represent the Trump administration? And then in addition to that, coming back very specifically to this panel, is what do you think is the right role for government when it comes to investing in and researching and scaling energy technologies?
Yeah, so, trying to move things through Congress many times can be a challenge, but what we ran into in 2017 was trying to build consensus on what to go focus on for the country. And it turned out a giant consensus was in discovery. And we increased funding for the university system across the country, for the national labs across the country, to historic highs. And it's been hurt recently because of inflation, right? Where the support of funding for UChicago, UC Berkeley, and every other important institution because of inflation. There was a giant increase in discovery. And by the way, it wasn't just in the physical sciences. It was at NASA and going to the moon and all these other things that were going on. And so we're seeing the benefit of a lot of that early discovery. So let me give you a battery storage one, right? So when we awarded the one and only battery storage hub when it was issued, for some reason they diversified it across 2 this last time. I'm not certain I would have done that. I think I would have left it 100% at UChicago. Maybe. We were looking at the frontier. What's the future? Right? Not the past, not even the current, but what's the future, right? And so when I showed up, most of the battery storage work was in lithium-ion optimization. Now, Tesla and others were doing fine work on that. That's not discovery science. We won the Nobel Prize. Our research team won the Nobel Prize that we supported for the lithium-ion battery. I went to the Swedish event, and it was fun, and it was a great dinner. By definition, if you win the Nobel Prize, you've kind of succeeded at discovery. That's a good measure. And so we decided to completely shift to the future. We actually de-emphasized lithium-ion at Argonne, at UChicago, and elsewhere, to the 30-plus other chemistries that could accomplish the things that Calvin was talking to, that you were talking to. Because for those of you not familiar with chemistry, there's probably more than one chemistry in the world. And one of the ones that started here, I'm on the board of Dominion, and we're building several thousand megs of storage in Virginia to manage data center and our giant 12,000 megawatt of solar that we're building. It's a huge amount. Was a series of chemistries that came out of Argonne, came out of UChicago. I'll give you just one to your exact point. So the iron air battery was helped developed at Argonne National Lab. The iron air battery is 80% cheaper than lithium ion, 80%. It is 25 times the duration. Instead of 4 hours, it's 100 hours. and the materials are iron and air. That's kind of, so we got some of the material here, and then it's iron. It literally rusts and derusts. Okay, that's the chemistry. Okay, no cobalt, no lithium, right? None of these other materials, 80% cheaper, 25 times the duration. And Argonne and UChicago were a part of that development, and now it's being deployed at the company I'm on the board of, one of the first utilities to deploy this. So some of these, I want to make sure everyone kind of sees that, right? This is many times you kind of get these kind of high-level points. Get a real example of a real impact this institution made that moving forward to the future or not just looking at today. And this is where you get the tension between industrial policy. Do you invest lots and lots of money in what has already been invented, or do you invest in the future? And that's the big policy debate that you get.
I'm definitely going to come back to that in a moment. And in case you're not following the news, Paul has been on some lists for an Energy Department position should Trump win. So pay extra close attention.
This was his warm-up.
Yeah. The questions might be tougher next round, but just want to make sure folks are aware of that. I won't be asking Paul exactly what he thinks on this right this second, because I know he won't comment. But just to say that this is a very timely conversation. I want to lean into one of the core components of the Institute, and that is the global picture. And Shirley, I want to come back to you on this question. Most of us are probably aware that the global market for all clean energy technologies and also batteries is already dominated by China. How will the Institute's research consider that dynamic and the broader global competition?
Yep. So I think this is an excellent question I would hope to address. So first of all, I would like to readjust everybody's perspective a little bit. Today, lithium-ion batteries' world production capacity is 1 terawatt hour per year. Just for your information, it took humanity 150 years to reach lead-acid battery 1 terawatt hour, and took us 30 years to reach lithium-ion batteries 1 terawatt hour. And the US's peak power is 1.2 terawatt. So in fact, when we do the math, what is the total amount of batteries that is needed for enabling energy transition? That number from different sources is about 200 to 300 terawatt hour. Okay? Yeah, you can check the Tesla master plan. You can check some Rodian Group consulting reports, our own forecast. So 1 terawatt or 2 terawatt, including lead acid, it's going to take us 100 years to complete energy transition. So my main point here is that we will need to discover more terawatt hour energy storage solutions, and innovation is the only possibility to go forward. So yes, maybe for the lithium-ion batteries, that China is taking this leading position for the 2% job done. I think it's very important for the entire world to face this reality that energy transition, China will play a very important role, but the rest of the world, we all have to play equal amount of important roles, include India, include the Europe, include North America. So I think the time snapshot, a lot of the news media have represented is the 2022 time shot that China occupies 70% of the total world production and controls 90% of the supply chain. But if you reverse back 20 years ago, Japan controls 90% of the battery market, and they control almost all the supply chain. Because at that time, we are only at a couple hundred megawatt hour. So I think this time series data, that's where I would really, I'm so glad I'm in the Climate Institute, because there will be a lot of the expert in terms of how we incentivize scaling in the North America, in Europe. That is the question that only scientists alone will not be able to solve this challenge. So when I look at the China's dominance, I also want to remind everyone, China's grid is 80% coal-powered. And please remember, if you take anything back home today, battery is not renewable. We are not renewable. We are enabler for renewable energy sources. And that actually bear a lot of resemblance between the battery technology and the oil and the gas industry, because you need mining, refining, production, recycling. And the good news for battery recycling, everything is solid or liquid waste. So I can have 100% recycle success. And by the way, Argonne leads the nation's battery recycling center. So I hope that answers your question. I am not worried about the China dominance for this time slot, because for this time short, yes, they're leading, but it is a race, right? It's a global race, and in the end, all of us should race to the sustainable future. So I'm glad that China is taking the lead, but I'm also very confident through innovation that the North America and Europe will join this race and contribute our part about the battery production and manufacturing.
I want to thank you for that, Shirley. I want to come back to Paul on this question and then come back for a domestic look at the global challenge to you, Calvin, in a moment. But Paul, what's your response to Shirley's comments? I would love to hear what you had to say. And is it, do you think it's okay that China may dominate in lithium-ion batteries if there could be other ways that other countries could lead? And do you think tariffs is a good way to pursue that type of policy?
Yeah, so once again, I'm going to sound like I ran the Office of Science, so I apologize for that. But it's a little bit like the Gretzky quote, which is, where's the puck going to be, not where it is today. If you go back just 20 years ago, the last generation, almost everything that we're deploying today did not exist 20 years ago. Stop and think about, was Tesla around 20 years ago? Not really. I think actually the answer is no. I did lots of wind and solar in my life. PV solar was not. It was actually a Berkeley project in 2009, 10. PV solar was not even close to being economic. The lithium-ion battery was still a science experiment funded by the National Science Foundation and DOE. And so everything that we're deploying now, to a large degree, and drilling technologies, once again, unconventional drilling, not considered anything likely at the time. You add that all up together, that's what we're all doing today. And so it was invented within the last generation. And so if you go, and it's too long to get into, but if you look at the pipeline of what's coming up, whether it's multiple fusion opportunities or all these different battery chemistries, it swamps the opportunity, okay, that we accomplished already and what we're doing today. So if you add that all up together and you talk about the competition point, and I'm not saying that lithium-ion isn't important or the LFP battery isn't important, right? But the opportunity set to go where you want to head is so vast, right? Way better than what we've already accomplished, right? The U.S. went from the largest energy importer in the world to the largest energy exporter this last year. We just accomplished that, right? Largest developer of technology and the largest capital markets in the world by far. So the raising of private capital for all this, we swamped the world. You add up all of that, yes, there's competition from overseas. Yes, there's competition from existing technologies. But once again, if you think about the future, right, we've done it, and the opportunity is even better, and I think the focus on the future is more important.
Calvin, let's turn to you, and would love your response to any of these comments about the global picture. But coming back to the domestic impact of, for example, China's dominance in clean energy, what China has done across the clean energy realm has been an incredible benefit to the United States. And can you talk about how you, as a company, have been able to implement some of these energy storage technologies and otherwise, because it's been made so much cheaper due to what China has done?
To your point, China is playing a dominant role in all of this, has been stated. But here's the challenge. We operate a critical infrastructure. So when you have tensions on a global scale, the geopolitical, you have security issues. So when we have conversations with the administration on what can we do domestically to develop this ourselves, because of the security concerns we may have with the foreign nation, that's real. So as we go to implement some of this new technology, that is a question that we must answer and therefore the time of implementation or even advancing that technology is lost. But what you do get is that a bar is set. By that bar being set, it encourages partnerships like with our national labs, with organizations such as MIT, University of Chicago, EPRI. All of those organizations then lean in with a concerted effort and focus because of the partnership with the federal government, private institutions, and academia to say we have to get better and we have to get quicker. And that efficiency is developed because of the pressure that's being put on us by China. So that's really where the end went, because I do not believe those public-private partnerships with government and academia would exist but for those other pressures being laid out. We have a hidden jewel in our national labs. And I would argue that most in this room, or at least in the country, do not know what's existing out there and the studies and the research happening in the national labs. They're setting the benchmark, but then how quickly can we get what's happening there and with the universities into commercial availability? That becomes the gap, but yet the opportunity. And if we do not have those partnerships, that lag will continue.
That's fascinating to hear you say that you have concerns with regards to security in terms of being dependent on foreign technologies, and that's prompted you to do some partnerships. That's really interesting, and it's a good segue to, I want to spend a minute, and Shirley, I want to turn this question to you. You know, partnerships we've heard it so many times over the course of this afternoon. They're the lifeblood of everything going on, particularly for a problem as omnipresent as climate change itself. So Shirley, what is your strategy for partnerships at the new institute? And would love to hear you comment on what Calvin said as well about the influence of security concerns on new partnerships.
Yeah, Kevin really presented the perfect point that I think that for any partnership in life, I think the starting point is always mutual respect. So I am someone who wear the hat as the faculty in Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering. I also wear the hat as a National Laboratory, Argonne National Lab person. And at the same time, I do have my own startup companies. And just like Paul, I had a little bit of the peek into the private sectors. I want to say that, once that we could set aside our differences a bit more, find the common ground. So, I mean, this threat, that security threat that put by the China dominance is actually one of those areas that drive us to come together to brainstorm about how we can do better together. So I want to say, hopefully next year's Climate Institute event, some of you will be invited to come to PME's Industrial Energy Transition Network space, where we will showcase how we build a physical space platform where we would really like to see university students and postdoc, Argonne scientists, and the private sector's people. We call it not internship, externship for the industry folks, that we want to use Climate Institute as a platform, actually provide the physical space and an infrastructure that allow this type of working together happen. So I certainly hope that's an invitation for next year, October, for having many of you come back to see how day to day we can actually operate, work together, collaborate together.
That's great. The final topic I want to bring up with our panelists is looking at something that's, of course, come up earlier in the afternoon about how the energy transition must not come at the expense of higher energy costs and stifling growth. So I want to turn this first question to you, Paul. How do you think about this issue in terms of, number one, let's ensure we move forward to clean energy in a way that keeps energy costs down? How does that inform your thinking in terms of research and science?
So some of you may not have gone to other energy conferences recently, but I was one that was sponsored by Eric Schmidt. That was a radically different, just 2 weeks ago, radically different set of conversations. That was about AI and energy, dramatic increases in energy needs. It's a good thing because we were talking about the economy. The amount of economic growth, 100 megawatt data center in our service territory We got 100 of them, not all the average, but a 100 megawatt data center is about a $5.5 billion investment. Okay, if you add up everything has to be put into that building, and we got about 4 gigs of that. So add up how much investment that's been made. It's like commercial and industrial rather than service economy, right? So we're making stuff in this country, and that's a good thing, right? And it's been a while since America has had this, commercial industrial where we need energy like China does or India does. This is a good thing, right? At the end of the day, it's good for the school system, the taxes. Believe me, if you're in Loudoun County, they got good schools now. So you got tremendous opportunity. In Virginia, we're supposed to double the amount of power generation in 10 years. So previously, it took about 30 to 40 years to build all the power plants that we have there. We need to double it in only 10. And Eric Schmidt and the people from OpenAI and AWS, this is all they're talking about right now, right? And so there's great opportunity, there's great upside for tax base, for economic growth, and so on. But you need to think about how are they, this is a little tough, but are they like free riders on the investment that the utility has made and the ratepayers, the customers have made for 20, 30, 40 years, depending on the asset type. And so there's a lot of debate in the industry about whether these new industries should take more than their average share. AEP, American Electric Power, has done that. At Dominion, we increased the transmission tariff rate to the data center customers and cut the rate to the residential customers. Okay, so actually the cost to the residential customers for at least a transmission component dropped for the residential customers. And I know you could probably comment to this with more detail than I can, but a lot of the utilities are thinking about how do we do that. And given that a lot of these new industrial customers do have a lot of profits that they're generating, and there's ways to think about that.
Yeah, Calvin, would love to bring you in on that. What's your response to that, and how can we keep electricity prices low as energy demand increases?
I missed a lot of what Paul was saying, because I was still stuck on what Shirley said. I had a perfect point, so I was really... Paul is exactly right. I mean, I agree with that. And what Paul goes down to, when you think about what he just said, it's all about the how. It's the rate design. Because going to how I started this conversation off, you can't do this if it's not done in an affordable and equitable way, because the noise and the pushback, but yet we have to do it. Going into not only security, but national security, we need those data centers stationed onshore. And I will give you something that, and I'll mess up the quote, so don't, if you know him, don't tell him I said this, Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, where he said, what we're not considering is that the data centers will get more efficient over time. So therefore, although we may be using X and Y today, tomorrow it will get to X, because they will become more efficient as they continue to learn. But it still goes into how we set it up today will drive it. And I got to give credit to those of you who live in Illinois. Illinois you talk about Virginia, is becoming a data center hub. Gil Quinones, CEO of ComEd, they're bringing about 6 gigawatts of data center load on, with another almost 10 gigawatts in the queue. People are coming to Illinois for a couple of reasons. One, the abundance of land. 2, the clean energy with all the nuclear plants. And 3, the rates that are being charged by ComEd. That is something that Illinois, you're just resource rich in that. And you're competing against the Virginias, and you're competing against the Texas, but that's the opportunity we have, but how we go about getting it is going to be very important. And then I would say the last piece of there is that our continued investment in technology to keep these issues at the forefront must be key. Sunny Elabua, who leads our chief strategy and sustainability efforts, is that we can't do it without continuing to grow. We have created our own model of where we're going to get net zero emissions within Exelon, but we know I have a clear line of sight to 80% of that. That last 20% is technology dependent. And I love the way Paul said it. We don't know what's coming, but we know it's coming, and we have to be ready to be early adopters of that new technology and scale it.
In our very final moments together, I want to do a quick lightning round, rapid fire, would you rather game. It'll go very quick, it'll be fun, no stress, won't be asking about Harris or Trump. Would you rather give up air conditioning or heating?
Ooh.
Air conditioning.
Oh, heating. We keep it at 59 at home.
Yeah. I would probably say heating. Yeah.
Would you rather have perfect weather forever or cheap energy forever?
I run a utility. Perfect weather. Perfect. Perfect weather, definitely. Yeah.
I would go with cheap energy. I live in Hawaii, and for some reason, I moved back.
Yeah, perfect weather for me. Because,
Thank you. Thank you.
And the final one, would you rather change the past or see the future?
Absolutely see the future. Please get ready for sodium batteries coming to your way.
I think I answered that about 5 times today.
See the future, yeah.
Yeah, see the future. See the future. Learn from the past and see the future.
On that note, thank you to our panelists
you.
for this great conversation.
So thank you to our panelists. You know, I am ready for sodium batteries. I hope that you all are too. But I did take away that important point that energy storage is an enabler of the future, an enabler of harnessing of clean energy, but it doesn't make clean energy itself. And of course, the extent to which we can capture those benefits, that'll determine how much we need to adapt to a world beyond 1.5C. But realistically, we live in a world where we are having to adapt to a century of emissions. And thinking about limitations on how much we can adapt to, the next generation may face a break the glass moment trying to figure out what else is possible to help us accommodate what has gone before us if we're not able to change the past, as you said. So to prepare for that break the glass moment that our successors may face, the Institute is committed to impartially establishing climate systems engineering as a field of study to give us the information and the tools that we're going to need to make the best decisions possible. Under David Keith's leadership, who is a renowned geophysical scientist, entrepreneur, and scholar, the Institute will study supplemental technologies that may help us manage the effects of that century of greenhouse gas emissions that we're currently facing. He's worked at the interface of climate science and energy technology and public policy for over 3 decades. We are very lucky to have him here at the University of Chicago. He's best known perhaps for his work in solar radiation modification. He's worked on the economics of electricity decarbonization, but also public perceptions of emerging technologies, which are clearly going to be crucial to whether or not the technologies that are discovered and evaluated are used or not around the world. Joining David to talk about these risks and the potential impact and governance of climate systems engineering is Nat Cohen, who's president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. It's a leading independent voice for practical climate policy and action. He previously led the Climate Work at Environmental Defense Fund after a career as an academic economist. So he's a recovering academic economist. With them is Foreign Minister of Pakistan, Hina Rabbani Kar, whose term was marked by normalization of trade relations with India and building of ties with Pakistan's neighbors. She serves on the Climate Overshoot Commission and brings, again, that real-world perspective on what challenges and trade-offs we face in overshooting that 1.5C goal and what risks that might pose to Pakistan and its people and people around the world. So Amy will again serve as our peerless moderator please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that great introduction. Okay, another opportunity for audience participation. Raise your hand if you've heard of geoengineering. Okay, most hands just went up. Raise your hand if you think you know a lot about geoengineering. Okay, David should be raising his hand, and we've got one raised hand over there. So yes, rather suddenly, it seems like the debate around climate systems engineering and geoengineering and all of the different buckets of technology that includes seems like they've suddenly entered our mainstream debate. And yet we don't know a lot about it. Almost nobody raises their hands, and yet we need to know about these technologies, which is why it's one key focus of the new institute. And so we have such an incredible panel with us today, representing incredibly important views from different perspectives on these topics. First, I want to go to you, David. Can you give us just the lay of the land on how you define the different terms and technologies that fall under the bucket of climate systems engineering and geoengineering writ large?
Sure. So solar geoengineering is the idea that humans could deliberately alter the Earth's energy balance. The Earth is warming up now because the addition of greenhouse gases makes it harder for it to radiate heat back to space. And so it changes the balance between the amount of sunlight the Earth absorbs and the way it can radiate heat back to space. That's what's warming it up. And the idea is that there's ways to deliberately alter that could reduce some of the climate change that comes from accumulated greenhouse gases. So this ranges from really science fiction ideas of building a shield in between the Earth and the sun, which I think is pretty irrelevant for the next many decades, to putting aerosols, which is just a fancy word for a tiny particle that just falls slowly because it's small, into the upper atmosphere, or making some kind of clouds a little bit whiter. These are all things that could change the amount of sunlight the Earth absorbs, maybe think about changing it by 1% or so. And of those things, I'd say there's only one that we're really confident could be done by deploying existing technologies. That's putting aerosols in the stratosphere. So in some kind of brutal sense, it's clear that you could quite cheaply stop the world warming by doing that. But there are huge uncertainties about exactly how well it would work, what the risks are, and how it could be governed. So that's solar geoengineering. And then carbon removal, I think, is somewhat self-explanatory. The climate problem is, in a deep way, caused by humans taking carbon from deep underground, where it's been isolated from the environment for tens of millions of years or longer, and putting it into the active biosphere. And the only way, in the long run, to reduce the climate risks is to reverse that process. Solar geoengineering cannot reduce risks in the very long run. Cutting emissions cannot reduce risks in the long run. It can stop making them worse. If you actually want to reduce the climate risks, you would need to reverse the process and take the carbon back into the geosphere.
Thanks for that, David. A crash course in these important topics. Hina, I want to turn to you next. Kate mentioned your position on the Climate Overshoot Commission. Can you tell us how your involvement in that commission has helped inform your thinking on these topics, and how it helps you inform your thinking about how Pakistan should be thinking about these issues?
Okay, I don't think I can speak on behalf of Pakistan at the moment as an ex-foreign minister, but I think more in my capacity as the member of the Climate Overshoot. I have to admit, when I first came in and became a member of the Climate Overshoot Commission, literally on the first day, SRM was out there. We were warned that we were, the brown people were invited over there to normalize the introduction of SRM and to get authorization and those types of things. I headed there nevertheless. And my first reaction to that was, honestly, let's not even go there. And as someone who looks at foreign policy, I said, this is like the wars. Okay, we've just gone through the Afghan war, and I said, sometimes the things we want to fix create problems which are bigger than the ones that we intended to fix. Just like the Afghan war, we went and wanted to get rid of extremism, the Taliban, and terrorism, and we ended the war with more extremism, more Taliban, and more terrorism, right? So pretty much that side of the thinking. But I think what really happened was, and I think that's why I am here today, the experience of going through and listening to real, scientific, knowledge-based, rational thinking and reasons, and finding out that, and as a country which has been on the receiving end of climate wrath, 2 floods in 12 years, one of them costing us 33 million people affected, etc., one understands that the cost of of temperatures going above 1.5 degrees centigrade, UNEP tells us that it is going to 1.2, and the trajectory that we're following, it is already at 1.2, between 1.2 and 1.3, and the trajectory we're following, end of the century, we're looking at 2.6. So there's a cost attached to that. We are experiencing the effects of the warming of the globe. So when you have that bad, reality, and if you reach a level where that reality will become worse and worse, and the repercussions of global warming will be so out there, then will we have to, not as the first option or the second option, but as a last resort, perhaps go to options where there's not a lot of clarity as to what are the ramifications. So therefore, the Climate Commission, looking at all of these views, we decided that yes, not something that can append cutting emissions or something that can append adaptation. We need all of the above, but there should be a complete moratorium as we speak on large-scale deployment. But do we not need the research? So it's almost like if somebody tells you you need antibiotic to cure yourself, and you just stop having, you do not have antibiotic. In 2015, we told ourselves we need antibiotic, cut emissions. We didn't do it. And now they say there's a brand new drug. It can save your life. Do you not want to know what are the repercussions and ramifications of taking that brand new drug? So this is really the type of thinking that sort of took us to, yes, do the research, find out what could be the ramifications and repercussions, and also let's talk about governance structures that could eventually work around it.
So it sounds like you changed your mind from not even supporting research into it to actually now supporting research.
Absolutely, supporting research, yes.
And we'll come back to that. Nat, I want to turn to you, and a lot of people, including some environmental groups, are deeply concerned about even researching, let alone deploying these types of geoengineering technologies. And we'll get to that. But I want to build on something that Hina said about the climate impacts that we're experiencing now. Why are we even at a point where we're considering even researching geoengineering? And what is the state of play of emissions such that we're considering these types of steps?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Well, and thanks as well to the University of Chicago and the Institute. I think this is a really terrific development and a great move by the university. And this will really, I mean, we've heard all day how much this will contribute to our knowledge. So to your point, I mean, it's very simple. We're just putting too much pollution into the air, and that's trapping the heat. As David said, you can turn it around. We're just not cutting emissions fast enough. I'll say a little bit about what I mean. I do want to note, because I'm always, I want to avoid the gloom and doom. We heard, I was really interested in what Michael said earlier about, I was glad that Michael didn't adopt the sort of simple academic, pooing of the Paris Agreement. I was also at Paris in 2015, and we have made a lot of progress. If you look at where we were on the eve of the Paris Agreement in 2015, we were headed towards, there's always a distribution around these estimates, so never take a point estimate about temperature, but we were headed towards, let's say, a median estimate of 3.6, 3.7 degrees, with some risk around that, and a tail risk of being well above 4. And I think we just heard Hina said, it's, if you look now and the policies in place, we're about 2.6, 2.7 degrees. There's, again, lots of distribution around that. That's a degree Celsius of a bend in the curve over 10 years as a result of the Paris Agreement and everything it has led to. That's really important progress, and yet that's nowhere near where we need to be. If you look already at the extreme weather events that we're seeing, look at the double whammy of Hurricane Milton and Helene. I know a lot of people who thought Asheville, North Carolina was going to be their climate haven, and now they see that it's really been devastated by the flooding. So we're seeing those impacts happen everywhere, and that's why, and we're seeing those happen at one point, we've actually been at 1.5 degrees for the past 12 months. That'll come down. There are some temporary things happening. We're certainly at 1.2 plus, on a long-term trend.
So even where we are now, we're seeing those impacts. We know that emissions and the temperatures are rising. So we know we have to do something about it. And I think that's why we're having the conversation. I know we'll talk more about this. I just want to say, we'll hear this again and again, it really is important, even as we have this conversation, we don't take our eye off of the importance of mitigation and adaptation. I think that's sort of a given here, but it's always worth saying. And I know we'll come back to that tension later on.
I want to dive into this idea of research. And David, I'll be coming to you for this question. You know, you and other experts, and we've heard that from Hina as well, emphasize really the big difference between researching this technology and deploying it. I recently had the pleasure of asking former Secretary of State John Kerry what he thought about geoengineering, and his first very strong reaction was extremely negative toward the technology. But at the very end, he said, but I'm not opposed to researching it, which helps give credence to why David is here at Chicago doing this research. So David, what are you hoping, or what are you planning to have your research help determine about these set of technologies, to help allay concerns from people like Kerry?
Yeah, let me first kind of actually jump in on the political Kerry point. So it's great that he said that, but just as a sort of level setting, it's important to know that the US government basically has no research program on this. Formally, the White House laid out the details of the research program, but then were very careful to say they weren't funding it. So it is quite amazing in a sense that this thing that there's actually thousands of papers on, and it's been reviewed by IPCC and many other 2 National Academy panels recently and a National Academy panel back in 1990, and there's really evidence that it could be quite profoundly useful in reducing climate risks, including climate risks for some of the world's most vulnerable, that the concerns about this kind of moral hazard effect are so strong that the decision by, say, the US is pretty much to say, hear no evil, see no evil, we won't have a research program, which is, I think, will change, but it's striking that that's still the position, despite Kerry's comment. So what will research look like? I think it's important to say that this is not like a new technology somebody's cooking up in a laboratory where the next step is to test it and have a proof of concept. A gentleman last night at dinner was asking me about how would we do a proof of concept test. I think there's a deep sense in which we don't need to. This is really building on atmospheric science that's been around for half a century, or in some cases closer to a century. So there's really, it sounds overconfident when I say it, but there's really no question at the level of basic climate science that if you have a little bit of aerosol that will reflect some sunlight and make the Earth a little bit cooler, this is not an obscure piece of climate science. It's really right at the mainstream. There have been more than half a century of detailed science on the way aerosols reflect sunlight and their impacts on the climate. So the issue is not, is it sort of fundamentally doable? The issues are all about the confidence with which we could predict what the effects would be and what the harms would be. And that's really the central thing. So it's not so much about a test, but it's about ways to reduce the uncertainty of our science and to have more confident assessments about that science so individual members of the public and public policymakers could make decisions. So maybe I would say the most basic thing. If these technologies were used, it is certain that there would be some harmful side effects and some unexpected side effects. That's just true of any large-scale intervention. The issue is how big those are and how they stand compared to the benefits. My read is there's actually quite strong evidence that the benefits would be very large compared to the harms, but I might be wrong. And the central thing that we need is the ability for science to more accurately say what those benefits and harms would be, and that's really what the objective of research is.
And let's not forget that society is actually currently undergoing a massive experiment of our planet with climate change itself. It's just less coordinated than what we're trying to do here, and I think that it's an important status quo because either way, there are risks and trade-offs. Hina and Nat, would love to turn to you. And what type of answers do you want to get from the research? In other words, pitch David on things for this new institute to research. And coming from your unique perspectives, Nat representing environmentalists who have deep concerns about the moral hazard concern, which we will get to in just a moment, and then Hina, from you, like, in terms of representing, a lower income country who has to grapple with the impacts of extreme weather today, What kind of answers do you want to see from the research?
Okay, you know, to be honest, I'm less concerned about the answers I'm going to get from the research. I think the research needs to happen, and this is what the Commission clearly articulates. I'm more concerned about SRM or any other technology which is in some ways not one which is currently being used to fall in the trap of climate diplomacy and the divide between North and South. And that is a really big trap. Having experienced firsthand that something as simple as loss and damage fund, which is a fund which is required for the immediate needs of a country or a people or a region which has been hit by a catastrophe which is climate-led, took us 20 years and God knows how many COPs to get through. And it literally, I think, took floods of 2022 in Pakistan, 33 million people affected, for it to be politically get the mandate to be pushed. This is how bad we are. So I would be very, very concerned that SRM would fall into the north-south trap of having taken positions which are not based on where ideas and facts would lead you, or logic, as I say, logic and rational thinking would lead you, but where positions would lead you, right? So very, very, very concerned about that. In terms of the research, clearly what we need to know, look, I think most scientists feel that it is kind of a simple answer that it will cool down the planet. But what will be the cost of that? Whether the diversity of the ocean, what will be the cost and what will be the long-term ramifications which may be unknown to us today? Can we go around that? And the second really big question, I think equally important as the research, is the governance structures around it, right? Because geoengineering is not going to really respect borders. So Amritsar and Lahore, where you do it in Lahore, it goes to Amritsar, etc. So it's things like this that you really need to think through, and that's why really, even though I'm not answering your question directly, but I would at this point say that please let this not become a North ask and the South, let it be something which is seen to be done by scientists which are hailing from all over the world, which is, it is collaborative effort, and let us not fall into the trap of countries taking positions which are not led by logical, rational thinking, but just by positions that they've taken historically.
That's such an important point, and so much of our current debate on so many topics, including climate, really seems to fall into this North versus South debate. And unfortunately, with countries in the global South not getting their fair share and facing a lot of climate hypocrisy. That's a whole nother panel in and of itself. Nat, I want to come to you on the research topic. How is researching geoengineering being received by those in the environmental community? Not to ask you to speak for others in the group, but considering you talk to this community very closely.
Sure, so I'll just make 3 points here. One is on the sort of climate hawk, what I see as the climate hawk view for research, which probably supports David. The second is what I see in the community, and I don't speak for the range of environmental NGOs. And then the third point, I want to echo something that Hina said, which I think is really important about how the research is done. So in the climate hawk case, I mean, the key point here, and I think David has referred to it, but a lot of folks who have focused on the concerns around solar radiation management focus understandably on the risks of doing that. And as David said, there are real risks, but there's also risk from not doing it. And that risk trade-off is something we just need to understand much better. Kate said, there's a break glass moment. I often use the analogy like we may need to break the glass in case of emergency, but we need to know what's behind the glass. We need to know whether, is that a fire extinguisher? Is that something else? Does it even work? So we have to be doing the research to understand what it is that we're talking about and whether it would be useful, whether it would have the benefits, what the risks would be, how we would manage those. We know that if a volcano erupts, it cools the earth, but I think hopefully we can do better than that, and so that's really important. So I think that's the climate hawk view for research, and I think more and more groups in what you might think of as the sort of center of the NGO community are coming around to that. My old organization, Environmental Defense Fund, really happy to see them go out on a little bit more of a limb. I mean, C2S has been there for a while, but we're small and kind of non-aligned, and so it was nice to see EDF kind of step out on the research side as well, and I think that's really important. We're breaking a taboo that has been there before. At the same time, we need to understand there are lots of civil society organizations. I think almost 2,000 civil society organizations have signed a solar geoengineering non-use agreement, And that just tells you the depth and the breadth of the concern. And we need to deal with that. Because this is only going to succeed, and the research will only succeed if we can build that breadth of stakeholder support, or at least understanding. And that just takes me briefly to the third point, which reflects on something Hina said. The way we do the research is really important. I think it's terrific that the University of Chicago is leading on this, but if this only happens in places in the US and North America, it's just going to fail tomorrow, right? We have to be building the capacity of the research throughout the world, including in the global south, including in the countries that are going to be most vulnerable to this, because when we get to the questions about governance, we need to have an equitable conversation where many voices feel that they're not just able to be heard, but they're informed. So we need to be thinking now about how that research is done and how the research is supported in places around the country, around the world, not just in the US and Europe.
Now, you mentioned the 2,000 organizations that have signed a letter, a non-use for solar geoengineering, and we don't need to go through all of their concerns. I think some of that would be addressed in the research and the unknown unknowns. But one very overarching one is this moral hazard concern. So quick raise of hands, who here has heard that term and thinks they know what that means? Okay, so I'd say 2/3. For the few of us who think they know, but you're actually wrong, or for the folks who don't know, David, you actually might have been the first person to coin that term a couple decades ago. So why don't you give us just a brief definition of what that term is and why it's central to the debates on this topic?
So I probably miscoined it. I certainly didn't coin moral hazard. I used it for geoengineering, and I think it was in many ways the wrong construction. So the classic version of moral hazard is this idea where people don't see the full cost of their insurance. So if flood insurance is always covered by the government, then people rebuild in floodplains, and there's some moral hazard associated with that. It's not actually clear that moral hazard is quite the right term here. I think there's really two kinds of concerns. One is exploitation by people who have a strong interest in avoiding emissions cuts, by fossil fuel companies or fossil-rich nations that may overclaim about how well solar geoengineering might work in order to argue for slower emissions cuts. I think that's likely to happen. It's just the way self-interest works. And the second one is a kind of so that's one group against another issue. The second one is a sort of a temptation to take the easy short-term way out. The fact is, this is all about timescale. If the goal was only to reduce temperature change over the next, say, 5 years, then it's actually pretty clear-cut that solar geoengineering would be the most effective way to do it, because reducing emissions only very slowly adds benefit that adds over time. So if you think very short-term, solar geoengineering always looks right. But if you think very short-term, we're screwed. And you have to think long-term. The whole essence of the climate problem is we have to deal with the accumulation of carbon dioxide. And so there's this inevitable tension between short and long-term that is really at the core of the problem. And I guess I want to add one other, maybe some context that might surprise you. So for some of you, this topic may be new, and it's certainly new in the kind of broad public dialogue, but the topic is actually not new at all. The topic was there at the beginning of all the kind of modern debate about climate. And the first report to a US president in 1963 or 4 to President Johnson, in the National Academy reports of 77 and 80, the topic was there, and then the kind of moral hazard concern pushed it out of the climate mainstream. And the central concern is still governance. And so I have a quote I refound recently from an article Steve Schneider, a famous climate scientist who was a bit of a mentor to me, wrote in 1974 about climate engineering. We have the impression that more schemes will be proposed for climate control or climate engineering than for control of the climate controllers. It's easier to think of schemes for how we're going to, technical people like me can think of schemes much more easily than we can think of schemes for restraining and governing these technologies. And I think the central challenge that Steve said very well in this article in 50 years ago is how we govern these technologies in a divided world.
That's well put, David. And want to bring in Hina on this question about, for lack of a better term, the moral hazard concern, the risk that if we were to deploy or research or deploy either one is going to give a pass to people who want to keep emitting greenhouse gases.
I think that's a really big concern. And I think that's why at the Commission, this was something which was always there. And therefore, when we gave a proposal, We talked about what we call CARE, that first of all, cutting, C for cutting emissions, should remain the main goal. And there's no way around it, and you don't let emitters use SRM as a technology to, use it as a boat to continue to emit, right? And that with it, adaptation is the requirement for today. All of this, whether it's cutting emissions, transferring to green technology, or adaptation, requires climate financing. Now, coming from the developing world, it seems in the climate change area, the developed world will do what it will, and the developing world will suffer what it must, right?
Say that one more time for the audience, because I think it's really powerful.
So the developed world has been doing what it has, and the developing world will suffer what it must. Okay, as an emitter, as a less than 1% emitter, a country like Pakistan has been on the receiving end of climate carnage. Now, our people ask us, we are not the ones who've done it. Shall we take money from feeding our children and putting children to school, which happen to still be concerns in a country like Pakistan, and transferring to green technology? And you have a certain limited pool of resources. You have the debt burden, and all of that in the developing world, when you're told, oh, you need to cut emission, and this is how costly it's going to be. Now, in Pakistan, interestingly, unlike the United States of America, we don't have the luxury to be climate deniers. Guess why? Because we are on the receiving end of the wrath of climate change in many, many different ways. So weather patterns, I was just discussing with you. I brought a coat to Chicago. I Googled. I should be wearing a coat right now. Now, the cost for me for the change in weather pattern is my coat is lying unworn. But if you're a farmer in Pakistan, and during the wheat weather, the heat is not what it's supposed to be, the cost is far more than just having to keep a weather coat, a coat which is lying. So things are very real. We cannot afford to be climate deniers because we have to experience the cost of climate change every day. We have not been the contributors to this. So when we're asked to pay the entire cost repeatedly, people are. So I think it really depends on what your worldview is. Do you want to live in a world where, as I said, the developed will do what they will and the developing should suffer? Or do you want to maybe go to what the Climate Change Commission recommends, the idea of differentiated responsibility? Okay, those who have emitted more should perhaps do more carbon dioxide removal, should perhaps do more, spending on development financing, so that, and we are so bad as, I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit pessimistic. I have no reason to be optimistic on this thing because I was in government at that time and there was carnage. There were 33 billion people, and I went back to the Foreign Office and said, let's sit there and find out. There has to be some financing available for immediate funding of these people. And guess what? There wasn't. There isn't. There really isn't. $100 billion for climate financing is what is pledged. The requirements are 20 times more, and what actually comes from the pledges is perhaps 100 times less. It's it doesn't look pretty out there, right? So let's not try and say, oh, we did pretty well. Where I come from, we didn't do very well, collectively, as human race. So this is the humanity problem. It's not a David problem, Henna problem, or your problem. It's everyone's problem, okay? And it does not respect borders. And I think we still don't get it. We think that we will go to our high-rise buildings and protect ourselves. And the poor must suffer what they will. It will not respect any borders or any GDP per capita. You can't wear your GDP per capita and say, oh, climate, please don't come, spare me. It doesn't happen like that.
Such powerful words, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Nat, I want to turn to you about this risk of if we do geoengineering, it will soften the pressure on other things. What I heard from you, Hina, is that it needs to be both, or potentially geoengineering, but definitely still mitigation of emissions.
Yeah. So
Nat, does this concern you, though, that it could actually change the debate and give the fossil fuel companies?
Well, so let me start by saying, absolutely. And as I said in the beginning, it always bears emphasis. We have to be doing much more mitigation. We have to be doing much more. We have to be putting finance into adaptation. And those have to take precedence. And I don't think anyone's debating that, but it's just worth saying that again and again, right? Because I think that's really important to hear. The second quick point, though, is actually I just talked about the importance of adaptation, and everyone agrees and nods along. But 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I've been working in this area long enough, there was a whole moral hazard debate about adaptation. Oh, if we talk about adaptation, is that going to take away the pressure to act on mitigation? And we figured out how to make sure that didn't happen. And we have to be talking about adaptation because of the impacts we're seeing. I'm not saying it's as easy with solar geo or with SRM, but I just make the point that just saying, well, boy, there might be a moral hazard, doesn't end the conversation. And then here's the third point, and this maybe is where I have a little bit of maybe an unusual view. And my view is, that actually talking about it alleviates the moral hazard. And here's what I mean. The naive view, let's say the Freakonomics view, for those of you who read that book. I'm an economist, so I can knock on Steve Levitt. So the naive Freakonomics view is, oh my gosh, we have this technology. It's aerosols. We can put it it's just like a volcano. It's just like Pinatubo. It's so cheap, we can put it in the atmosphere. Doesn't that sound great? Cost benefit must be amazing. End of story. If everyone believed that naive view, there is a moral hazard, because then you say, oh my gosh, that seems like, why are we spending all this money on cutting emissions when we have this great technology? But as soon as you understand, A, that it's a temporary solution, I mean, it could be a long-term, it could be a temporary solution over many years, but it doesn't address the cause, it only addresses the symptoms. And B, that there's significant, real potential risk from using it, and that we don't understand those risks, I think that starts to alleviate the moral hazard. I think, frankly, people start to say, wait a minute, you mean if we don't get our act together and cut emissions, like we might be doing something that's like a massive planetary experiment that could have devastating consequences for oceans and life on Earth? Like, that doesn't sound so smart. Maybe we ought to go back to plan A. I think that giving more information on this can actually not only improve on the research side, as we've been saying, but alleviate some of that moral hazard.
Definitely, and I just want to call out in our final moments that we didn't quite get to carbon removal, which is another part of this debate. And I think that's reflective of where our conversation is going. Carbon removal is getting more firmly put into the mitigation category, where it probably fits a little bit better given the way it is structured as a technology. And so we'll have to save the conversations about that for the reception. In our final moments, I want to do one more rapid-fire lightning round. You guys were in the audience for the last one, but the questions are different. Got to keep folks on your toes. Would you rather live in Chicago in the summer or winter? No, nobody jump first.
Winter. I actually faced that choice because my other home is Alberta, and I like the cold.
Oh.
I take the winter. I love the snow. Yeah. Never get enough of it.
I don't know well enough, but I'm going to take the summer from what I've read.
Yeah.
Would you rather speak every language in the world or communicate with animals?
Absolutely communicate with animals.
Animals for sure. Yeah.
I'll take every language in the world. I'm just.
And would you rather change the past or see the future?
See the future.
See the future.
See, I saw that one coming. I want to change the future. So that's
And that's why the Institute's here. I want to thank our panelists for this conversation.
Super. Thank you.
I hope you all found today as inspiring as I did, although at times a little terrifying, so there's a little bit of both in there. But I thought Hina put it really well in envisioning a world in which logical, rational thinking informed by evidence drove policymaking going forward. And all of these pieces, I hope, come together to get us a little closer to that world. As you've heard, this institute was a long time in coming together, but it's obviously just the first chapter of much, much work to come. And I'm truly grateful for all of our panelists, but even more for all of the faculty and students and partners who are coming together to help us make a difference here. You are all, of course, part of that, and that's part of why it's so exciting to see you all here. But this is just the start, so please continue to engage with the Institute going forward in every way that you can. We're going to have lots of opportunity to dig into these issues over a long time, but starting over cocktails in the lobby. So please join us in thanking all of those who participated and then heading out to a reception outside. So thank you all.